afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the City Council Redevelopment Agency meeting of January 8, 2007. First item on the agenda is our Pledge of Allegiance. Will be led tonight by Troop 321. Gentlemen.
Color guard, advance. Audience rise. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
2. Audience may now be seated. Color guard, please pledge the color. Color guard retreat.
Thank you, gentlemen. Well done.
Come to the mic. Come introduce themselves.
Would you like to come up to the podium and introduce yourself and tell us your troop number and anything else you think we'd like to know?
I'm Ryan Burton, and I'm Troop 321, and I go to Sacred Heart Prep High School, and I'm a senior.
Thank you, Ryan. We'll see you a little bit later.
Okay.
How about the other fellows?
I'm Jonathan Four, and I'm the SPL for Troop 321.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Andy O'Connor. I am a assistant scoutmaster for Troop 321.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Kevin Taylor, Life Scout in Troop 321 and a 10th grader at Menlo School.
Very good. Thank you all again. Well done. Next item on the agenda are changes to the order of agenda. Would anyone like to suggest a change?
Mr. Mayor, through the chair, would it be possible to change, move 8E up after 8B? In other words, just dropping C and D down one?
Anything's possible.
Is that a problem, Mr. Weiss, at all?
Problem.
Okay.
Would that be okay with everyone else? All right. Staff, any changes? Pardon me? You come.
8E moving up.
8E moves up
After 8B.
After 8B.
Thank you.
Any from staff?
We have none.
Thank you. And the agenda stands as stated. Council communications and announcements. How about Brad? Would you like to start?
Sure. I just wanted to report to council, as you know, we discussed about our new liaison positions. So the chair of the Park and Rec Commission, Cecily Harris, and I met last week. I can't remember week to week. I believe it was last week, and had a good conversation about how to begin sort of working together, how to progress being a liaison with the Park and Rec Commission, and some general topics that they may want to take a look at. We talked a little bit about a work program, a 12-month work program, as we've sort of discussed in some of our joint meeting once before, and it was a good meeting. I look forward to hearing back from Park and Rec Commission after they have a discussion. I guess it won't be in their next meeting because it's not agendized, but it'll be the meeting after that. And we sort of roughly discussed meeting on a quarterly basis, but obviously being available for other things as the case may be.
Very good. Thank you. Councilmember Griselli.
I haven't had a chance to meet with the youth. In fact, the youth group has, the youth council has their meeting on Wednesday night, which is the same night as the fire board meeting, so we'll have to work that out, but I'll be speaking with them and then the senior advisory group also. I wanted to report from the City and County Association of Government meeting that I attended in December. That is, the acronym for that is CCAG. I'm the representative of San Carlos there, and some really fascinating things are happening. One of the most important is that you may have read in the newspaper that I think we're finally going to get an extra lane from Millbrae to San Mateo on Highway 101. And there are funds available, and CCAG is one of the major proponents of that. And I think we're finally going to be able to accomplish that goal this year. I think that's all I had.
Thank you. Councilmember Grocott.
Nothing to report from any committees or anything like that. None of them met between our last council meeting and tonight. I did want to ask a question, though. We used to get warrants in our packets, and I know that we're not getting those anymore, but I thought we were going to get something in a bunch on a quarterly basis or some kind of basis, and I just wanted to review that and find out when we should expect to get those.
Okay. Staff, you have any response to that?
As I recall, we changed the ordinance last year so that they would not be provided in your packet, and they were to be provided periodically to the council. I'm not sure of the time periods that we're supposed to do it, but we'll look into it and provide them. They're also available for the council anytime they wish to see a copy on a monthly basis.
Okay, so we'll get the schedule resolved, and we will be getting them on some sort of a regular basis after the fact. Right? Okay, anything else, Matt?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, I have a couple of items. For those of you who may have been here a little longer than I have, the Florida was really looking pretty good, and they were beating Ohio State 21-14 when I left home. Just thought that might interest you. And they were looking really good. Second item, I did meet with EDAC. This is our Economic Development Advisory Committee. They're working on the review of the Economic Development Plan, which is in process, and they are also working to the public presentation of that plan and to get public comment. It was a good meeting, and I plan to meet with them on a regular basis from here out. Most of you perhaps saw the paper on Saturday. The rumor that Foodville was moving to Bell Market is no longer a rumor. They're not moving. I have this from a reliable reporter who talked to the Foodville manager. They're going to stay right where they are. They're going to do a remodel, but they're not going to Bell Market. So that seems to be the last word, and we'll watch them take care of their business where they've been these many years. I also got in the mail a CD from David Luther. David, as you might recall, is the director of the choral group that sang for us at the tree lighting ceremony, the Torchbearers. Does a wonderful job. I thought the kids were great. The CD is really good. It includes 6 of their songs. And there's a little note on the card, thank you for the opportunity to sing for the town. And we all enjoyed them. If you are a parent or a relative or someone involved with the group or would just like to be entertained again, I presume these CDs are available. You might check with one of the elementary schools. I also got a letter from Carol Groom, who's the president this year of the Peninsula Division of the League of California Cities, and she's asking that our council designate a liaison to the division to meet with them at their quarterly meetings and to work with them in some of their projects as time is available, but basically be the liaison between the division and our council. And I'm just wondering whether any of the council members have been involved with the Peninsula Division of the League of California Cities. Has anyone been going on a regular basis? Would anyone like to go on a regular basis?
I've gone to a couple of things. I'd be happy, depending on the day and time, I can probably go. I mean, if we need a representative.
What is the day and time?
Do you know the day and time?
They don't specify it. It's a quarterly meeting.
Okay. Well, I'll volunteer to attend. If there's a problem, then maybe we'll have to go to Plan B.
All right.
And I'm happy to back Bob up, provided it's not daytime.
Okay. Well, they're not daytime.
Usually they're evening, and they, yeah.
Stuff for the
Okay,
working
so
man.
Bob is the lead and Brad is the alternate, no?
Mr. Mayor, you're gonna contact Carol and.
I will.
All right. Thank you.
And then finally, I have a report. I have been talking to several residents about the situation with traffic and the crossing at Chestnut and San Carlos Avenue. As you know, we had a terrible accident there a couple years ago. A lady was killed, another one was badly hurt. We've had other people who have had close calls, and I continue to get reports from primarily the seniors who find that a very uncomfortable corner to cross. And I had to take some time during the holiday season to watch the pattern of cars and to try to get a feel for the speed of cars. And it does seem apparent to me that our 25-mile-an-hour zone is being exceeded by 10 to 15 to 20 miles an hour above that. And I think there are various reasons for that, but I've asked the staff to begin taking a look at this, and perhaps we can consider it at our February retreat and have some more discussion on it. I think that's potentially a dangerous situation. I know we've done the yellow signal light, but that doesn't seem to be quite doing the job in terms of addressing the speed and the potential danger for some of our folks. So with your concurrence, we'll add that to our February list, and we will make that one of our discussion items. Okay, Councilmember Doherty has arrived. Do you have a report for us?
No, sorry, I was late.
Okay, then we'll move right along to the reports to council from staff.
Honorable Mayor, members of the City Council, we're happy to introduce tonight the new Community Development Director that's been hired by the city. The Community Development Department will be comprised of the building, housing, and planning functions here within the city of San Carlos. And we did a nationwide search and found somebody right in our own backyard that lives in San Carlos that has agreed to accept the position. Mr. Al Savay has come to us from Mountain View and has worked in Daly City prior to that, and perhaps if Al could just get up and introduce himself to the council, I'd appreciate that.
Welcome, Al. It's great to see you. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, good evening, Honorable Mayor, members of the City Council. I want to tell you how excited I am to be here this evening, and this is a real fantastic opportunity for me as a 11-year resident of the city of San Carlos, and I look forward to working with all of you and the citizens of San Carlos, so I look forward to working with you.
Very good. Thank you, and welcome again. We look forward to working with you. Okay, anything else, Mark?
Nothing more.
All right. Then we have time for presentation. Ryan, it's back your turn again. From time to time, we have the opportunity of awarding a proclamation to scouts who achieve the highest rank in scouting, which is the Eagle Scout honor. I think Ryan is the third scout from Troop 321 this year who have been presented to us, and we want to recognize him for the achievement that he has in terms of where he has brought his scouting to this high level. We all know the importance of scouting. Many of us have had children involved in scouting. Perhaps some of us have done it ourselves. And it's a wonderful program. It's a wonderful program of building an individual, both in terms of their individual character as well as their ability and willingness to serve the community. So it's always a pleasure to honor one, and we'll do that now with Ryan Burton. Ryan, on behalf of the council and the citizens of San Carlos, I want to congratulate you, present you a proclamation on your achievement. Part of your, one of these badges, I'm sure, called the Stevens. So we want you to talk a little bit about your project. And use the mic.
Well, for my project, me and some of my helpers from Troop 321 designed and built 7 bird feeders to be put up at Oakwood, which is a retirement home for nuns at Sacred Heart Preparatory Campus. And so I put those up around the school, a couple on poles and a couple hung, and I think they've really enjoyed them.
Good, Ryan. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I must say you've had quite a graduating class there at 321. That's you've been very active for the last few years, I'm sure. So it's good to see yet another come to us. All right, we'll move along to item 6, which is public comment. Public comment is limited to 2 minutes per speaker, and is intended for people who have a comment on something not on the posted agenda. I have one card, Pat Bell.
Pat Bell, San Carlos. You each got an email from me, but I want anyone who's watching on TV to also know that I heard over the weekend that Beverages and More wants to move into Bell Market. And so anyone watching on TV who wants to should contact his or her favorite council member to let them know what they think of that idea. And what I intended to talk about tonight was retirement costs and so forth. There's always in this country we have provided retirement for public servants. Our federal representatives get a generous retirement even after serving time for malfeasance in office. They get a nice retirement. Our public officials in Sacramento, our teachers at State College get a nice CalPERS retirement. My son is a union electrician, and his retirement and benefits are very generous. I mean, it's amazing. He has more put into his retirement every hour than a lot of people make every hour. So, to the people who have stood at this podium and sat in those chairs and complained about the firefighters' retirement, I say maybe you chose the wrong profession. Maybe you should have done something more lucrative if that's what you want. I heard a story on CNN this morning about a man who worked at a Ford plant in the Midwest, and the plant closed last year, and he took the buyout. He has lifetime medical and lifetime retirement, not a 401k or any of that business, an old-fashioned pension. So I realize that there are a lot of people nowadays who have 401ks and various things, but there are also places where you have an old-fashioned retirement plan, and CalPERS is one of them, and firefighters aren't the only people who get that. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. I can't speak for the other council members, but your email was news to me, so we'll see how it plays out. I'm sorry. Any other members for public comment? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 7, approval of consent calendar. Consent calendar items are considered to be routine and will be enacted by one motion. There will be no separate discussion of these items unless members of the council, staff, or public request specific items to be removed for separate action.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make a motion to approve the consent calendar. However, on item 7G, which is the RCN Telecom Services being transferred to Astound Broadband LLC, I would simply request, if it's appropriate, that we get a follow-up on that at some point once that has taken place, so that we can get an idea of where we're going with
Okay.
this.
I'm sure we can. Before we ask for a second on that, is there any members who'd like to actually remove something from the calendar? Seeing none from staff, anyone like to remove something? Or from the public? All right.
Then I would move approval of items 7A through, I believe it's K, gets us to the bottom. Yes.
There's a motion by Councilmember Grocott. Is there a second?
I'll second the motion.
Second by Councilmember Griselli. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Grocott?
Yes.
Councilmember Grisilli?
Yes.
Councilmember Lewis?
Yes.
Councilmember Teagle Doherty?
Yes.
Mayor Davis?
Yes. Brings us to item 8, unfinished business. The first item is consideration of proposed naming policy as part of the Alternative Fund Development Program. Barry Weiss is coming forward. Good evening, Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of the City Council. Tonight, I'm here to talk about a problem that you and I are very well aware of, and that's dwindling resources. Along with dwindling resources, we have an increased demand for parks and recreation facilities, programs, and services. none of that is news to either of us. But what I bring to you tonight as part of the Alternative Fund Development Program is a solution. The items that we have done for the Alternative Fund Development Program began in March of 2005. Those of you that were on the Council or Parks and Recreation Commission were part of a presentation by Mr. Bill Kegler, who told everybody about the whole concept. City of San Carlos decided to pursue it. January 23rd of 2006, the City Council approved the conceptual plan and directed staff to form the Parks and Recreation Foundation and to draft an MOU for City Council approval. Part of that direction was to also return with specific policies, one of which I stand before you tonight, and that is the naming policy. We also had a community advisory task force that helped in the creation of the MOU and the whole program, and specifically the foundation, how the foundation would be structured and identifying potential trustees. At this point, before I go into the specifics of the naming policy, it is with great pleasure I'd like to introduce the members of the new San Carlos Parks and Recreation Foundation that are present with us tonight. I'm going to read off their names in alphabetical order and ask them to stand if they're present. First one is John Baer, who is a local developer, lives in town, and is very active in many foundations and fundraising activities. We also have Dr. Denise Brown, a distinguished surgeon from Sequoia Hospital, very active with their foundation, and is also helping us with the Burton Park play equipment to raise some funds. We have Debbie Denton, who's very active in the community, specifically St. Charles and the youth sports programs. She also has experience in fundraising and foundation work. Mr. Howard Girdlestone, who I should mention was our first trustee. He is a local person, local property owner, also is very generous with his time and his talents, and he's on many boards, including Sequoia Hospital, as well as the Youth Center Foundation. We have Cameron Miller, who's a local estate attorney, active in town. He also sat on the advisory task force to help put this together, as did Mr. Girdlestone. And finally, number 6, we have Laura Nish, who is the past president of the Education Foundation and is a fund manager, as well as having children in town and very active. So if we could, at this point, I'd like to just take a moment and thank the foundation for stepping forward to help us with this. The naming policy that you have before you, the request, is the first in a sequence of policies. The Parks and Recreation Commission at their August meeting unanimously endorsed the naming policy. The policy is consistent with the philosophy outlined in the Alternative Fund Development Program that the Council approved last year. The naming policy provides for naming of facilities, buildings, landscape areas, even strategic programs, in return for private sector funding. This is commonly known as legacy giving, which is now the #1 form of gift giving today, surpassing even estate giving. Typically, it's used for capital projects, but certainly can be used for strategic programs. This naming policy would provide a tool for the city and for the foundation to meet the community increased demand for programs, facilities, and services. What we're proposing is something that universities and hospitals have been doing for decades, and they, through their efforts, have secured billions and billions of dollars in private sector assistance. We would be one of just a few cities in the country starting down this road. You have the cities mentioned in your staff report, everywhere from Wheeling, West Virginia to El Paso, Texas. In fact, the city of San Carlos has conducted this type of activity since 1992. Right now, you can have your name on a brick at the downtown park. You can have your name on a bench. We named rooms after specific donors. Mr. Girdlestone was generous enough to assist us with that and has his name on one of the rooms at the Youth Center. The policy we bring forward tonight, however, provides clarity as to the city controls and the appropriate funding amounts. The policy is before you. Just a couple highlights. According to this policy, we would not name any asset without the necessary monetary gift. Those facilities with a commemorative name would not be available for naming rights. So that's Burton Park would never be changed. That would always be Burton Park. Nannerone Field would always be Nannerone Field because those are commemorative names that have already been institutionalized. A naming right carries no power of direction or implied direction, so if somebody wants to give us significant dollars and have their name on an asset, that they don't get to start indicating to city council or staff this is what they would like the city to do. Now, this policy is aimed at really a minority of people who have funds and are willing to give funds for these types of activities, for this type of legacy. There are many other people in town who don't have the funds to make that kind of significant donation, but they also need to be recognized for a lot of other things. So this is really just one piece. We also are in the future going to do a wall of fame to recognize people who maybe have not had significant dollar contributions. And we will also continue our current practice of people that make smaller donations. We recognize them in many ways. We give them a letter, we give them a photo opportunity, publicity, even temporary signs like we did when we did Hillcrest Circle Park. If you remember, the neighbors put up $40,000, some as small as $20 increments. And we put people's names on a sign that was up, before construction. So we will continue to recognize people. This policy is a strong policy and is needed along with the memorandum of understanding that we will discuss next on the agenda. But a strong policy is needed. It clearly gives the new foundation the ability to seek naming opportunities. The trustees would need assurance when negotiating with an individual that a naming right is available. The City Council retains lots of controls in this process. The Council, with review by the Commission, will approve the master plan that will be developed. That will be the key vehicle for going forward with the identified projects that we would like to have naming components for. The Council has the ability to approve the memorandum of understanding that will be next on the agenda. The names have to be in keeping with the vision and mission of the city and of the Parks and Recreation Department. We will come to Council like we always have with approval of capital improvement projects and identify that there will be a naming component in there. Also, once we talk to an individual that is seeking this kind of financial opportunity, once the agreement is finalized, we will have a detailed contractual agreement with them, and we will work with the city attorney on putting that together. The Council will be kept informed about negotiations, and at the end, once a person has been selected, of course, everybody will know that name. So this naming policy is part of a solution to a funding problem, and it's a first step to meeting the community demand for increased park and recreation facilities and services. And at this point, I would be happy to entertain any questions you may have.
Thank you, Barry. Do we have questions for Barry? Matt?
I just have one. Looking at the example you give of the formula that's in our packet, it's easy to see how we get past the initial contribution, which would purchase, the example here is a bench, and then the lifespan of that bench is 10 years, and there's enough money there to take the interest from it, buy another bench. And so I could see that. What I couldn't see was how that worked past year 2 to the full extent that it didn't in the first time around, because I don't see how it keeps up with inflation. The example here was you buy an $800 bench, 10 years, you've earned $1,000. Ostensibly, inflation has made that bench, the replacement value, $1,000. So you're fine in year 10 or 11 when you buy the new bench. In year 22 or 21, you can almost buy the bench, but you maybe have not kept up with inflation, so you can buy less of a bench. And of course, with the bench being the example, it's not that important, but if we were talking about, a building or something larger, it could be important.
Correct. And the endowment amount would be of such size that it would guarantee that. And so the formula I have in front of you is the formula we would follow, but the endowment amount would have to be big enough to keep drawing on the interest and keep maintaining that building and then renovating it. A building probably needs renovation in 20, 30 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Bob?
No questions.
Ben?
I have a question or two. whenever we talk about naming policies and so forth, I can certainly see the strengths of it. My question is at the point where we need to talk about limitations, in other words, obviously we don't want to name on everything in town, should we be so wildly successful to have that opportunity. So there's sort of two things, and I think it's perhaps a procedural question. In other words, maybe there's a plan that gets derived by the foundation, and then that plan comes back for us all to look at, Park and Rec Department as well as council. But I'm not sure. I guess that's part of my question is procedural. But at some point, we'll probably want to limit the total number of things that are named in town if we get to that place in time. And then the other question I had was related to that, and that is, my guess is also there'll be some minimum standards for gifting. In other words, some minimum monetary amount, so we don't get the situation where there's, say, a lot of, I don't know, $50 pots around town or something like that for flowers. I guess what I'm wondering is, at some point, there's a little bit more of a detailed plan that gets put into place. Does that come to us, or what's the procedure from here on those types of things?
You asked two questions. First of all, the first part of it would be the master plan will take care of that. As you know, we're about to go out to come to you, I hope to come to you at the next council meeting with the RFP for the master plan, to hire a company and go out and let's put together this master plan. That will be a real key vehicle. Once council approves that master plan, we'll identify a couple projects in there and ask the foundation to prioritize that and go forward. So council will know, and we will bring forward to you capital projects that we want a naming component on. So you will have that ability to say, okay, we've got enough names out in the community, or no, we don't. So it would take care of that way.
So perhaps a component of the master plan will be, we've identified this area, we're willing to accept a naming component to this for funding, and that will be part of the master plan that we all feedback in. Is that?
Yeah, it's break down a little bit differently. The master plan will clearly identify the things we need to be doing, total, and funding opportunities, and naming certainly could be one of them. But we would come to you individually with capital projects and say, let's say that we needed to renovate Burton Park, the Kiwanis building. We'd come to you and say, okay, we want approval for this project, and there will be a naming component with it. And if you approve, then the foundation will go out and negotiate with somebody and, get the money.
Okay,
that's in an ideal world.
So if Cows Jump Over the Moon Corporation X decides to, they want to do a $3 million athletic field, we would have a chance to interact on that and sort of approve that notion or not together.
To approve the idea, do we want a name on the field? Yes. And just to be real clear and make sure that I haven't hidden anything here, the council would not approve the name. That would be, you would say, we're approving a naming component, and okay, foundation, go do your work.
Okay, and then
we are going to come back with a separate corporate naming policy, by the way.
Okay, that sort of leads to my next question, which is can you talk about the corporate naming policy a little bit?
Yeah. Let me go back to that $50 thing. Let me come back to corporate. We agree. We don't want a bunch of nameplates everywhere. I think it's Colgate University has trees with plates on 4 sides of a tree. But what happens typically is they only get enough money to plant the tree. We're talking, bigger picture. The corporate naming rights will have some different tweaks to it too. This overall policy, we could walk away with this and be done, but I want to come back with a separate corporate naming policy that'll be a little more specific toward corporations. Certainly with legacy giving and individuals in the community who have the funds, I'm not sure what problems we could run into unless they become an embezzler or something. But if you get into an Enron situation, we're going to have safeguards built in, as well as currently in the naming agreement that we'll sign, the contractual agreement, all that stuff will be built in.
Right. I just want to make sure, I think it's a fantastic opportunity. I just want to make sure we proceed really carefully because obviously, there's if you take this to an extreme, it can get a little bit silly. And I want to be sure that we're doing it in a tasteful way while we're trying to, sort of honor the idea of someone being able to sort of add something to the city and also get a legacy for it. Thank you.
Those safeguards are built in. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, just to follow up on Brad's comment, it seems to me, Barry, that it would be helpful for the council if you submitted a list of items to the council that we're accepting money for. so that we're focused on what you're looking for, and then perhaps that list can be refreshed every year at the budgetary time, at program review time, so we all keep focused on what it is. I wouldn't put dollars on it because I think dollars are flexible depending upon how much someone could donate and what we want to cover. But if we're willing to name City Hall, then let's put City Hall on the list, or the library, or whatever. And if someone comes up and would like to designate a name to an item not on the list, then I think it would be good to bring that to the council and advise the council that you'd like to add that to the list because you have an interested sponsor. That, I think, would eliminate Brad's concern, and I think would give some clarity to what exactly we're trying to name.
And I apologize if I didn't make it clear, but that is the process we definitely have in mind.
Okay.
Excuse me, through the chair, one other thing comes to mind, and that is there, in the long run, will there also be a sort of definition of how it's named? In other words, what it looks like on the given facility? Will there be, again, just to exaggerate, to make my point, rather than having a 20-foot by 20-foot wide banner that declares who named it, we'll have some sort of aesthetic signing policy that'll come along with it?
Correct. That's why number 9 is that it says that the Parks and Rec Department will have final approval on all naming, including wording of plaques, press releases. That would include size, what it looks like. Yeah.
And that'll be determined by the foundation or by the department?
That would be determined by the department.
So that's maybe something that we'll look at together.
And I work for Mark, who works for you, so we're all part of that. Yeah, we keep it within the city.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Through the chair?
Yes.
When you're finished, I
I
have
was just
one more
going
question.
to suggest that we might want to take a look at item 8B before we vote on 8A, just to see how this whole package comes together. They are separate items, but it might be helpful if we have that discussion as well. Matt?
Yes, something came to mind that I hate to bring it up, but it's kind of a real-world situation. It can happen. And that is, if something gets named, we accept the name, and let's say it's in the name of a family, for instance, or Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and down the road, Mr. and Mrs. Smith get a divorce. Are they allowed to come back and change that, or does it stay where it is, or how do we deal with that? Or I'm just looking down the road. Like I say, I hate to bring up that kind of thing, but...
I assume you're providing that as a hypothetical example.
Yes, I am.
It actually has happened to us before.
I know it has.
And that's why you need an agreement, a written agreement ahead of time. So, and the agreement could say something along the lines of, it's named, it's done, or it could say, in this case, then we would need approval of both parties to change the name, but that would be written out ahead of time as well as any possible remedy. So that's where the contractual agreement comes in.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? All right, Barry, why don't you lead us through item 8B then? We'll
Okay.
come back and vote on 8A.
Thank you. And the MOU was provided second because of the language about the naming policy. The MOU is the working agreement between the city and the foundation, and if approved, would begin the formal relationship between the city and the foundation. Again, as mentioned, the Alternative Fund Development Program that the council approved and the commission approved included the draft MOU. The new foundation has looked at the MOU and has made comments, and they added the mediation clause that is included. The foundation, by doing the MOU, the foundation will be off and running, and the foundation is eligible for grants that government agencies are not eligible for. Also, there's a lot of individuals that will not give to government. Even though you could give money to the city, and it's 100% tax deductible, people won't do it for a variety of reasons, but they will to a nonprofit. Most nonprofits will not give to a governmental agency. They will give to another nonprofit. So the foundation is the key vehicle to the entire Alternative Fund Development Program. And at this point, I would be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Okay, questions for Barry on the foundation. This is a separate entity. It's an unincorporated 501c3 organization, stands alone. The MOU is intended to outline how they're going to work with the city, specifically the Parks and Rec Department, in affecting this program.
Question here?
Yes.
Barry, on page, this is under the Memorandum of Understanding itself, and on the third page, it talks about bonding, that the officers will be bonded.
Yes.
And I don't really have a question about that, but it did lead me to another thought, which is the foundation would have overhead expenses and such. Can you walk us through that a little bit about how, people are giving money to the foundation? There must be some kind of limit or ceiling or to how much overhead will be. Has any thought been given to that?
We've had some discussion of that, both with our consultant, Mr. Bill Kegler, who you remember, as well as the foundation board themselves. And again, they've had experience with this. And actually, at our last meeting, we talked about a percentage not to exceed it. I forget what the percentage was, that could be used for administration. Because you're right, there is going to be costs that the foundation has to make all this happen. Currently, I'm just absorbing costs out of my budget. But that can't go on forever. And so we've already talked about a percentage. And what we will do when we go out for donations, we will tell people up front from the beginning that, X percentage would go toward administration.
And is there an X percentage that's being bandied about, or I don't want to pin you down on something necessarily, but I do know it's an issue. When you get phone calls and you're asked to give to XYZ, that, for myself, that's one of the questions I always ask: how much money is actually going to the cause, and how much is overhead and profit, or not profit but overhead? And,
right. It's a low amount.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Any questions for Barry?
I have a couple of questions. One was, it's talking about confidential donor information, and where there's confidential, I guess my question is, when I was reading through this, we have sort of compliance reviews, then we have confidential donor information. And as much as I know it's probably important to enable confidential donor information, it's also important with some of the potential conflicts of interest with donating money to it that we know where the money's coming from. So how do you resolve those two things? In other words, and just so I'm sorry, so everybody's, I was reading section 11, and then also section 12 when it comes to compliance reviews. So can the Park and Rec Department, if there's a confidential donor, can the Park and Rec Department it says in here, can reasonably request that information, but can the foundation say that's confidential, we're not going to supply that information?
The way the confidential information, I would ask City Attorney Bob Lanzone to jump in to help me if needed. Most people that want confidentiality during the negotiations. So if they want their name on something, they want during negotiations to be confidential in case the negotiation didn't work out. Others may donate funding and not want their name on anything. They just, out of benevolence, they say, here's X amount of dollars for this project. Typically, though, their names are in the books, and if we access the books, we would access those names. And but what we would not do is, make it into a public release or anything like that. Yeah.
Well, and I don't want to turn this into something that, that a cynical point of view on it. It's simply the thing, if we have a confidential donor and there's a compliance review, can we actually look at the confidential donor so we can apply the compliance rules?
I think that Park and Rec can audit I think what's being granted here is the right for Park and Rec to audit the books and records of the private nonprofit. Otherwise, there would be no right for anybody except the IRS to audit the books of the private nonprofit. Once any of that information came in, let's say, a written form to Park and Rec, then there's an issue as to whether it'd probably be public record at that point in time. So they'd have to be careful not to cross it over the line, keep it at the private nonprofit, and just audit. If I'm answering the question.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a sort of a delicate line there, and let's not anticipate any problems on that. I guess the only other thing was it says there's going to be annual compliance reviews. My guess is, though, with a working relationship, there'll sort of be continual compliance reviews, just so we, on a regular basis. I hate being in a position where we look at something annually, and 9 months ago there was something that was out of compliance, because then it can obviously create a complex situation.
I'm an ex officio member of the foundation. I'll be the one working very closely with them, and we wouldn't let anything go out of compliance that long.
Great. Thank you.
Yes, Inga.
Yeah, I just had one question, and it has to do actually with Section 3 under Articles of Incorporation. It says that in the event of the dissolution, the foundation's assets and records will be distributed to the City of San Carlos. Was it ever considered to keep those funds in either a trust or in some way and have the city become trustee rather than them, I'm assuming, being distributed free and clear to the city? And it says actually for Parks and Rec services rather than for the maintenance of capital assets.
Yes. This is very typically the way it's done. I don't know if there's any IRS regulations, but once you dissolve a corporation, you have to do something with the assets. And since the foundation is being set up to support City of San Carlos Parks and Recreation, then the funds would be given to the city for Parks and Recreation services. And because donors will have given money for Parks and Recreation services, this language here prevents the city from giving it to another department or another use.
So in the event, and I'm hopeful that we're not going to have a dissolution, but in the event that there were to be one, whether it was because of lack of community interest in maintaining it, are we contractually obligated at all under any of the contracts that would have been signed with donors that those monies be held in perpetuity for the preservation and maintenance of whatever it is that their endowment has gone towards?
Yes, my understanding is that if somebody's given enough money to have their name on something, and we've got that contractual agreement with them, whether we've got their money, we have to carry through on that our end of the bargain to provide that name.
But the contract is between the foundation and the donor, so if the foundation is dissolved, then the contract, then I would imagine, would be, or is the city obligated to maintain those contracts in the event of a dissolution of the foundation?
Yes. That's my understanding, is those contracts would be binding on the city.
Because the foundation is doing this for
We've
the city.
accepted the funds.
Well, I'm just wondering.
Funds may go to the foundation, but yes.
So when they write the Articles of Incorporation, I'm just looking at it from a donor standpoint. A donor could be looking at it saying, well, this is just a scheme by the City of San Carlos to try to raise a couple $1 million for Parks and Rec and then dissolve the foundation, which I know is not indeed the intent. However, in reading this, it just sounds like, well, geez, after a couple of years, if we get kind of bored with the idea of this foundation, the foundation could dissolve. And I don't know what the bylaws read in terms of dissolution or termination of the foundation, but I'd be interested certainly in seeing that, and perhaps that's the next document that comes along.
Any contractual agreements we entered into, because the foundation is doing this on behalf of the city Parks and Recreation, we would have to honor that contract.
So would it make sense to have something in the memorandum to that, basically to state that?
I'm not sure it's needed. Bob?
I would think if we put it into the contracts, that's
the point.
Yeah.
So go into the contracts, okay.
Correct, yeah.
All right, well, thank you.
Okay, Matt has another.
If I might, I have a few follow-ups. One was based on Councilmember Teagle Doherty's questions. I wasn't, Inga, what section were you in?
Section 3.
Of the MOU?
Yep.
Because I'm looking at Section 16, where it talks about termination, and it says, in the event of termination, the foundation shall provide the city with an accounting of all funds in its possession and transfer those receipts. I take it that receipts is another word for funds?
Correct.
Correct. Along with any restrictions thereon
And that
to
would
the city.
that would be an agreement that we had for a naming, correct?
That would cover some of what Councilmember Doherty was speaking of.
Thank you. Good point.
And if I may, Mr. Mayor, a couple other points here. In Section 7.1 under standards, there are 3 numbered statements, and the first 2 use the word should. The last one uses the word shall, and then if you read Section 8, it also uses the word shall twice. And I highlighted those because I was questioning why in items 1 and 2 the word shall is not used and should is used instead.
My understanding is that should and shall mean the same thing. I would defer to our city attorney if there's a difference.
I think the council member raises a good point, and I think we should just change that language in the agreement.
To shall?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's it.
Shows you what I know about legal language.
Okay, good call on that. I just have one item to add to the discussion. I did talk to Barry this afternoon. The foundation is also geared and is able to accept funds for operating purposes should the donor wish to donate for operating purposes. And well, it's not stated specifically. It's implied in the MOU. So not all the dollars will go to capital, presumably. If a donor would like to donate to operations, he or she can do so. Any other questions? I have a speaker request from Pat Bell on both items. Pat?
Actually, it was just on naming, and Brad has addressed some of my concerns. I just think this has the potential to get really tacky. And, I can see Bevmo on Laurel and Google City Hall and Verizon Athletic Center and, And what are you going to do when some outfit whose name you don't want on anything in town comes along and says, the Porn Stars Union wants to sponsor, your favorite field. I mean, when you get to corporate sponsorship, how are you going to define which corporations you want to have naming things in San Carlos? And I hope that once somebody buys the name of something, it's going to stay, because the athletic arenas and fields in the Bay Area have changed names so often. I don't know which side of the Bay Monster's on, and what used to be Pac Bell is now something else. I hear it on the news. I don't know what they're talking about, because they change all the time. So get enough money out of the person or the corporation so that it's going to be the same name forever.
Thank you, Pat. As most things in life, the devil's in the details, and we'll trust the staff and foundation to deal with the details and keep the city and the city council whole.
Through the chair, can I ask
Yes.
one additional question?
Yes,
It's a follow-on
certainly.
I didn't catch before. And perhaps, Bob, you can help me with this one. On 6.2, Section 6.2, Item 6, that it basically says any gift, grant, or contract that includes a financial or contractual obligation binding upon the city must have prior concurrence in writing from the city council or its designee. So does that mean for every single gift received by the foundation, theoretically, we would have to, in writing, accept those gifts and accept that contractual obligation?
That's the way it's written.
So would it make sense to come up with a threshold that it's any obligation or any obligation over a certain amount? Or I'm just wondering if, because we certainly don't want to hamstring the foundation, and, we also don't want to have whoever happens to be the mayor at the time be sitting there writing the city council, approving city council. So I would suggest that, and I don't know that we need to solve this now, but maybe give direction to staff to come up with something that's reasonable.
I think that's the point. I think the intent for the foundation was not to come to the city on every gift. So I think that's going to have to be worked out, because we've raised this issue about having whatever gift is given and a name selected be binding on the city. So for it to be binding on the city, somehow the city's going to have to be contractually obligated on that. So I'm going to leave it to the foundation to work with us and come up with something that would be acceptable.
The reason I like the language in there is because it says or designee. So if we designate the Park and Rec Director as our council designee, then it's not like we have to, as a council, or assign the mayor to approve all those things. We have a designee. And obviously one of the critical things in this is what's the cross communication between the foundation and Park and Rec Department and council. And this, so I like this clause in particular because that's where I think things sort of come together on the naming and accepting of gifts and so forth. So I like that clause.
I think in general I agree with you. Again, I come back to this threshold, and maybe some of it has to do with Ms. Bell's comments about if we're going to get a gift or donation that exceeds a certain threshold where it is going to be a significant gift to the city, and therefore along with it have a significant sort of contractually binding, that perhaps at that point we as a council do review it, but for anything below that threshold, that Parks and Rec, that's fine, feel free to do that. So I don't want to hold up the MOU this evening just for that, and what I would almost suggest that we do is that we strike that language for the purpose of today's MOU and then have staff come back amending it with additional, or Bob's frowning over there.
Wouldn't it be a better, Inga, if we...
Just kept it in and then amended it?
Well, if we have the problem before we try to solve it, I would hope that we have more donations than we can possibly handle. And I think that I'd like to see the initial donations and how they're processed. We can always put a limit in and, stretch it out. But even if it's $500, it'd be nice to see the process work through the system and understand how it's going, and we can raise the bar.
Well, my belief, the intent of this language is, if we have someone who wants their name on a facility and they give us enough funds, and it's to keep the facility going, that's nothing unusual. But if somebody wanted to put a caveat in that we also want the city to widen the street by my house or do something like that, then that's a different contractual obligation, and obviously we'd come to council about that. Council would have already approved a project or a program to have a naming component, so that's already done. And if they want something else, we're not going to accept any money on anything else that's binding in a different manner without coming back to council.
I would also think if we have the designee, we could assign a financial restriction to that. It's a designee, and items under $10,000, above $10,000, the city council will be the deciding factor in that. I mean, I think we have that option with this language.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I apologize, but the point's raised, so it's my turn now, I guess. Through the chair, one of the things, and I don't know if folks read it, and I hope they did, or maybe glossed over it. One of the things here is if I'm ABC Corporation and I want to give $100,000 to name a field, yeah, that's fine, and the foundation accepts it, and it's great. But the last thing I want is my name, I could want, unless I want all the publicity in the world, is having ABC Corporation discussed at the city council meeting. Now, we have a foundation of 6 or 7 or 8 people that we're going to hopefully approve, or we have approved. And I don't think there's somebody that walked in yesterday. So as Pat's wild idea that came up, XYZ, whatever, that's not going to happen in my mind. But yet again, if ABC Corporation comes in, they don't need to have their CEO standing here explaining what they do, how they do. I mean, I think we're, and as Tom said, I think, or Mayor David said, I think we might be getting a little ahead of it to micromanage this thing. I'm not necessarily for that. We have I'm on the Youth Center Foundation. It's not quite the same because we aren't getting huge grants, but there's a similar trust in there, and the city has protection to make sure that those funds are used in a proper way. So I'm just a little concerned that we're going to get really too much into this micromanaging thing, and that's what the foundation's there for.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
The MOU doesn't just apply to naming. The MOU is any and all gifts that are made to Park and Rec.
Right.
So many of the gifts are just made to Park and Rec, and they're, other than a Park and Rec purpose, there are no strings attached, like keeping a name attached to a room or a building or a field. So the only time where we've seemed to raise a conflict is with the naming policy. And I think the foundation can work with Park and Rec on that aspect of the naming being binding on the city without having to come to the city council for every park bench and tree that has a gift attached to it, and that you're satisfied with the threshold of your obligation to retain a name on some particular.
Through the chair.
Yes. That's it.
When I read sentence 6 here that Councilmember Doherty brought up, it seems to me this is saying that it's only an issue if the gift, grant, or contract includes a financial or contractual obligation binding upon the city. In other words, if there's something in it where someone's giving a gift and saying, here's the gift, this is what it's for, and we want a contract with you that will include something that's a financial obligation. For instance, upkeep around the building. I'm going to give money. Whether I have my name on it or not, I'm giving money, and if I'm going to give the money, then you're going to do a contract with me that says you will keep the flower beds around the building in proper upkeep. And that now becomes a financial obligation upon the city. And so, therefore, that would have to be have prior concurrence in writing from the city council or its designee. Now, if somebody gives money and just says, here's money, go put it into this building, bye-bye. There's item 6 has no trigger.
Actually,
am I correct on that?
No.
Mr. City Attorney?
Well, it depends on, I guess, its interpretation, because what I prefaced with was, if in the event of a dissolution, are we contractually obligated to do something with the money? And the answer was yes.
If there's a contract.
But what Barry said is there's a contract between the donor and the foundation that upon dissolution, the city would be contractually obligated. So I just think we should clean it up one way or the other. I know what the intent is. I just don't think that the MOU does a very good job of the execution against the intent.
All right. Are we okay with where we are with what we have? And ask staff to consider these comments and come back to us.
Yeah, again, I think that because it's somewhat unclear, and I don't think that the council needs to see everything. I would like just to see 6.2, item 6, either modified or struck at this point with a just sort of.
So you'd like to strike
or clean it up.
Which one would you like to strike?
6.2 under the conditions of gift acceptance.
Would you like to have them take a look at all those again?
No, just number 6.
Number 6.
Because that's the only one that I think, again, there may be times where it doesn't make sense for it to come to council. There may be other times where it does.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I generally am not in agreement with that. I think you need the clause in here for just the reasons that Councilmember Grocott mentioned, in case someone says, I'm giving you $10,000 to maintain fields and you have an obligation to perform maintenance or something like that, then you should have the right to say yes or no as a council, because it's going to include your costs, maybe other costs to you. The only point I see where it comes in some kind of conflict is in this naming policy, where we're going to maintain a name on some. The contract was with the foundation, but yet the city is going to be bound by that contract to maintain the name. There's a little conflict there. We have to work that out. I think you can go with the MOU as it's written now, and we can bring the clarification back later on the naming policy.
Okay. Inga, can you accept that?
That's fine.
All right. Do we have any other comment on the item 8A or 8B?
I would move approval on items 8 and A-B. 8B.
Second. We have a motion and a second to approve item 8A and item 8B. Any comment, question on the council's part? Then may we have a roll call.
Councilmember Grocott?
Yes.
Councilmember Casilli?
Yes.
Councilmember Lewis?
Yes.
Councilmember Teagle Doherty?
Yes.
Mayor Davids?
Yes. All right. And then we're
Mr. Mayor, if I could?
Yes.
I just would like to compliment the council for the due diligence everybody did reading all this. This was not an easy read, and it was quite detailed, and certainly something brand new. And as you're asking the questions, I was impressed that you really had done your homework and were very thoughtful about it. So my compliments to each of you.
Well, thank you and the foundation for putting this together. I think it's a big step forward. I think it's an innovative step forward, to say the least, and we're hoping for great things. So thank you very much, Barry and foundation.
Yeah. Thanks to the volunteers of the foundation. I certainly meant to say that as well.
All right, we have moved item 8E as next in order. Item 8E is consideration of changes in the funding formula specified in the amended and restated exercise of joint powers agreement for the Belmont San Carlos Fire Department. And Mr. Weiss will make a presentation.
Honorable Mayor, members of the City Council, the city's representatives to the Belmont San Carlos Fire Department have continued to work with the Belmont representatives on alternative funding formulas for the fire department, beginning with the new fiscal year, or projected to be with the new fiscal year starting July 1 of 2007. The staff report includes several different alternative funding formulas that have been discussed by the department. All of the formulas under consideration would shift the responsibility for funding partially from the City of Belmont to the City of San Carlos, because the formulas tend to have a factor in there based upon assessed valuation or population, both of which would put the burden more heavily upon the City of San Carlos. The Belmont San Carlos Fire Department held a special meeting on January 4th after we wrote the staff report, and actually then adopted a motion for your consideration that would endorse the Lieberman II model, and we provided a supplemental report to the council that itemized that formula, which would have the contributions determined by factors including 25% assessed valuation of property, 25% population, 25% calls, and 25% fire companies, or cost of service, really, for that fire provision. This formula, based upon the current budget for the city's fire department, is anticipated to cost an additional $170,000 to $250,000 for the City of San Carlos. The reason for the variance from $170,000 to $250,000 is predicated upon an assumption regarding cost recovery efforts and how fees are to be generated and accounted for within the formula. The cost, obviously, as the budget goes up, given that we're talking about a formula that would end up with the City of San Carlos under current assumptions with call volumes and the like, paying approximately 52.3% plus or minus. It'll vary from year to year depending upon all of the factors that we've mentioned, probably the most volatile being the call volume. But at this current year, based upon the data that was presented to the fire board, it's anticipated that the formula would be about 52.3% shared by the City of San Carlos. There are additional issues with regards to how that formula might be applied with regard to unfunded liabilities, with respect to assets and or other liabilities that the department might encounter either before this formula is put in place or afterwards. Those are details that I think we will have to work out once we have concurrence, or if we have concurrence from both respective bodies with regards to whether or not the basic premise for the formula is acceptable or not. There was considerable discussion at the board meeting, at the special board meeting on the 4th. Certainly from the city's perspective, I think the formulas that are weighted on calls and on cost are more advantageous to the City of San Carlos. Certainly those that are predicated upon assessed valuation and population are more favorable to the City of Belmont. But having said all of that, if you look at alternatives, and we did that last year, the municipal agencies that we've had opportunities to contract with would be as high generally, possibly even higher than the base cost for what you're currently paying for fire services, and you would still have the unfunded liability issue that would have to be addressed. And we produced a report back in November that provided some assumptions for how that might look, and if you were to assume that the cost of providing the service were roughly equivalent with on a contract basis with one of the municipal agencies, and still had the unfunded liabilities, if you were to pay those off over a 13-year period, it's about $1 million per year that you would have to be paying in order to pay off the unfunded liabilities within that 13-year time frame. The one alternative that does give you some option, because there's an annual cost savings based upon the proposals, was the California Department of Forestry. That would give you some opportunity to have a savings on the annual operating cost that could be applied towards paying off those unfunded liabilities. Implementation of the Lieberman II formula, if it were accepted by the City Council, would require an amendment to the joint powers agreement that we currently are in with the City of Belmont. City staff, special legal counsel, the city attorney stand ready to, actually special legal counsel in this case, stand ready to continue working with the City of Belmont and its representatives, the fire department, in drafting that language should the department give authorization to move forward with that. We would make those changes and bring back a JP amendment for future consideration by the City Council if you so choose to give us that direction. So this evening we're looking for council direction on the preferred formula, specifically in that the fire authority or the fire department has made a recommendation. Now on the Lieberman II formula, we would be looking for direction from the council with respect to that formula, any other formulas that you would like to give us authorization or direction on, and then perhaps some discussion on the application of that formula to the outstanding unfunded liabilities and assets that the department might have during the future years. That concludes my report. Would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, questions for Mark?
I just have one point of clarification. When you went through and did the comparison of net costs to each agency, it looks like for the net cost to San Carlos would be about $243,000. I'm assuming is that for 2007?
That's the net additional cost based upon the assumption that the current budget would, or that the budget would remain exactly as it is today. I can't tell you definitively what next year's budget will be. I expect that it will go up, and therefore that 243 number I assume will be adjusted upward to some degree. But that 243 is predicated upon the assumption that today's budget would be divided pursuant to the new funding formula.
And all of these assumptions, I noticed with the starting to look at the raising the fees for the mandated fire inspections, does that assume that those fees would go into the department and help offset the cost of the department, and then the funding formula would be applied after those fees had been taken out? Or that those fees would then go to the cities to help offset their fire, or the city, or in this case, the fire department?
As it's currently being proposed, there would be the funding formula that would not include those fees, and then each city would be given a credit for the fees that were generated from its district. And so, and that's different than what has historically been the case. There are a couple of things here, and then at some point I'll probably have to pull up Doug to get into the details here. But historically, if we look back to 2002, 2003, it's our understanding, for example, during that period of time, there were mandatory inspections that were conducted and fees were assessed, with those fees going directly to the department. In that, those inspections are more heavily weighted in the city of San Carlos because of the nature of our commercial areas and the like. Historically, the city of San Carlos has always paid a bit more than the city of Belmont for fire services, because those fees were coming proportionately higher from the city of San Carlos than from the city of Belmont, and the rest of the costs were being split 50-50. Now that's excluding some other categories such as hazardous contracts and the like, or hazardous materials contracts and the like. As being proposed here, the funding formula would be established, but each city would be given credit for the fees and permit applications, the revenue generated from that, and applied towards the payment that was an obligation for the city. So there is a shift. It's being moved from above the line to below the line, if that makes...
So to paraphrase back what you just told me, essentially the budget gets set. Then the funding formula would be applied, which would not be a 50-50 split, but would be a 47, roughly 47-53 split. And then each city would then get credit for whichever fire inspections or mandatory fire inspections, those fees would get applied against their percentage, that entity's percentage. And then the balance would have to be paid either through Fire Protection District in the case of Belmont, or San Carlos General Fund in the case of San Carlos.
That's correct. That's my understanding as has been discussed at the board. I would look to our representatives to confirm.
Okay. And so just as a follow-on question then, has there been any analysis just from the City of San Carlos side to sort of do some sort of future projections over what this means over the long haul in terms of, it going up by 6%, 8%, 12% based on significant shifts in any one of the four, because right now it's predicated on four major areas, 25% each.
Yeah.
And if we're intended to have either an increase in one of those areas that Belmont may not have the same, we may actually end up with a higher percentage of the cost and it going up at a much more dramatic rate than we'd anticipated.
We've not attempted to project how those categories might grow. We have looked at each of those categories in terms of how they're currently split. And I'll just off the top of my head, the assessed valuation is higher 60-40. In that neighborhood. The population is something like 53-47, with the City of San Carlos being on the higher end. The calls are 47-53, with the calls being this past year. But then if you look at it for a longer time frame, that again is probably the most volatile of all the categories. One year it might be high in one area and high in the other the next year. And the fourth category is fire companies, which would be 2 and 2. Fire engine companies, and unless we get into some details with exactly how that might be distributed based upon where the truck is located or some other factor within that category, you would expect, I think, with 2 stations being in each jurisdiction, for those costs to be evenly distributed, unless a station was closed in a cost savings measure, which would really have a rather minimal impact on how the overall formula would be shifted. But then you'd be expecting 3 stations to cover the entire jurisdiction's boundaries.
And so finally, just to, what you're looking for from council tonight is simply direction, not, we're not voting to implement any type of change.
Well, I think
it's just really more direction in terms of one over the other.
I think that's true. We do not have the JP amendment here before you tonight to implement this formula. But we are looking for the council to give us clear direction on whether or not the Lieberman formula that has been endorsed by the fire board, whether that formula is acceptable to the city council, and if not, why not, and what other direction we should be leaning towards. And I would turn to the fire representatives to give you some indication as to how those negotiations have gone and how strongly the representatives from Belmont feel about this formula and any variations to this formula. I've sat in on some of the meetings, and it's certainly my impression that the representatives from Belmont have indicated that a formula heavily weighted upon other factors such as cost or calls may not be acceptable to them.
That's to Belmont. And then lastly, the unfunded liabilities. So they're looking at the same percentage split based on unfunded liabilities, or are we still considering 50-50 or some other formula?
I'll have to admit, at staff level, that's not entirely clear to us yet. And the reason, I think, is that it gets rather complicated. There are between $16 and $19 million in unfunded liabilities. The majority of that are on PERS liabilities that are paid for in a side fund through our annual payments to PERS as part of our annual operating budget. There are different ways that you could handle. That's an obligation that we have, and the reason we looked at it, frankly, is because if we were going to disband the fire department and contract for services, you'd have this liability and you'd have to pay it off. Now, you might do pension obligation bonds, you might work out some kind of a contractual arrangement with PERS to make those annual payments over some kind of a time frame, and we've looked at 13, 20, 30 years. If you were going to do that under the current JPA, you'd undoubtedly split it 50-50. If you move forward and don't split those out and set up a pension obligation fund or something like that in order to pay off that debt obligation, The easiest way to deal with that on a moving forward basis is just to continue paying it off over time, such as what we normally do. And unless you accounted for it and tracked it and budgeted for it, you would pay it off under the new formula, which would be the 52-48 or its variation every year. So we've had those discussions at the fire board level. I think the way it was dealt with in the prior JPA agreement that was tied to the funding or to the assessment district funding allocation is that there was an amortization period where there was a recognition that the city of San Carlos in that case would have been paying 53% and a higher pro rata share moving forward for those unfunded liabilities. There was a presumption that if the city of Belmont opted out of the program in the first year, that they would make a cash payment to the city of San Carlos to make up the difference. And every year over a 10-year period, I believe it was 8 to 10 years, that would amortize and would be a lower level as time went on, with the assumption that being that you would have paid off and at that point you would have been 10 years into the new agreement and would have pretty much, I think, established a policy moving forward that the appropriate split for your costs were indeed 53-47 or whatever the formula might have dictated. So here we just haven't gotten into that level of detail with these discussions. There are some outstanding claims that may come forward that could be significant. We also need to address whether or not those claims will be dealt with on a 50-50 basis or on a new formula basis, depending upon whatever might be in place at the time that those claims come to bear.
So at least down payment of the unfunded liability over the next 8 to 10 years is part of the new JPA? Is that?
Well, again, we haven't worked out the details on this. There are a couple of different ways that it could go. My sense of it would have been that I believe the city of Belmont would prefer that the formula be applied to those liabilities that are paid for on an annualized basis moving forward. But again, I mean, that issue has surfaced. It has not been definitively dealt with, as far as I know, in terms of any motion coming from the fire authority. And so any direction or input that this council would have on that issue would be appropriate tonight for our representatives to hear.
Okay. Thank you.
Before we turn to the representatives, Chief Friday, do you want to talk to us a bit?
Well, just, Mr. Mayor and representatives of the council, the current PERS unfunded liability piece is currently absorbed within the budget of the fire department. The only thing that's outstanding is the medical retirement piece, and then, of course, reserves. So a portion of that retirement piece is now being done within the budget. It's on a $1.3 million annual payment amortized over 11 years. So we're into that now. What the timing left on that is, I'm not completely sure. I was trying to get that information before tonight, but that is plugged into the current budget as we stand right now. And so I think that, based on that, you need to know that component. The other part is in relation to the CDF proposal. Do remember that was done in the last year or prior to that, even 18 months ago, that proposal. And there's been a couple of salary increases on the firefighter side before the recent contract. So those numbers have not been absorbed into that component of the additional costs. So that piece falls into there too as an additional. That will increase the amount, the contribution piece.
So just for clarification, the 1.3 out of the 16 to 18 million in unfunded liabilities is in the current budget to be paid down. So there's a balance of roughly 15 to 16 million.
15 to 17 million, yeah.
I'm seeing.
Well, I mean, as the chief is representing it, as I understand it, that's an annual payment.
Right.
Right.
Annual payment.
Yeah.
It's an annual payment, right, Chief?
Correct.
So after 11 years, it'll be that.
So
of the 19 million, approximately 15 to 16 million is pension, and 3 million to 4 million
Is the
medical.
The medical.
Medical is not being amortized on a current basis in the current budget.
So the $3 million is the
retirement
balance of an unfunded liability that
In
we
effect.
currently
In
don't have a
fact, there's
solution
another one
for.
that we know in the future we're going to have to deal with. We think in the next year or two, we'll be coming back and having a proposal or some sort of a plan to deal with that component. Right now, we're doing the best we can to chip away at the bigger number.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for that clarification.
Vice Mayor Lewis has a question.
It's either for you or Mr. Weiss. So there are mandatory inspections that I'm not clear. Have they not been done on a regular basis over the last couple of years?
They have been done, and they've been done all along. A couple of years ago, the previous administration made a determination to stop with that inspection fee that had been in place, and all we're doing is reinstituting that component. There's roughly about 600 of what we call R1s, or apartment inspections, that are mandated inspections we need to do annually between the two cities, and we will just go ahead and reinstitute, which is already in the fee schedule, which has been adopted by the Fire Board. Our plan is to reinstitute that program and begin to recoup what we were doing a couple of years ago.
Right. And so assuming that we do that, what does that represent? What's the number that represent annually?
We're looking on the somewhere around $200,000, $203,000 between the two cities.
Between the two. And do you know what San Carlos component is of that?
About 120 in San Carlos.
And so that'd be applied against the whatever the potential formula that we had.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Well, I think it's time to hear from the gentleman in the hot seat.
Okay.
They've been in that seat over the holidays on a regular basis, so tell us about it.
Well, I'll make some comments, and then certainly if Councilmember Grisilli wants to add to, if I've left anything out, that'd be great. We did hold a fire board meeting to discuss, and this was just, I guess, last week? Wednesday, yeah. And the reason we called, it was a special meeting in the fire board, and the reason it was called was because the district, the Belmont district, had their meeting and resolved to a formula, which we've called the quarter formula, or 25-25-25 or formula, and it's also more intimately known as the Lieberman 2 model. And what we wanted clarification on as a fire board before coming to the council was two things. One was in the Lieberman 2 model was created at a fire board meeting amidst discussion, and it was a revision of the Lieberman 1 model. And Thomasville had his laptop in an set up in an overhead fashion so we could watch what was going on. And as we discussed things, he would change the formulas. And on the Lieberman, from the Lieberman 1 to the Lieberman 2, he was changing the percentages, and he simply took 25% and attributed it to fire stations, I believe. But there wasn't any real discussion by the fire board on that. And it seemed that he did it out of expediency. He just picked one of the categories and said, this will account for the 25%. So we wanted to discuss, as a fire board, did we really want it to be attributed just to trucks and engines, or just to fire stations, or, because in earlier editions, we had employees, we had trucks and engines, we had fire companies, fire stations, and other things in there. So we discussed that, and what we came up with was that Mr. Lieberman's intent, anyways, was that it should be applied to companies, because with companies, you get the other overhead, if you will. If you have a company, the company has to go out in a truck or an engine. If you have a company, the company has to have a BC applied to it. You have to have a fire station to have a company, all these things. So that's why Mr. Lieberman was thinking of companies. And the revision you saw when you got something in the mail, I think on Friday, after our fire board meeting, one of the things you saw or could have noticed was 25% was attributed now to companies, and we clarified that point. The other reason we wanted to have a meeting was to discuss what might be the intent from the Belmont side regarding, once we have this formula, if both parties adopt this formula, what's the expectation of everyone for how long the formula would stay in place? Because two reasons that came up. One is we do have in the new JPA agreement that the JPA will be reviewed every 3 years, regardless of whether things are smooth sailing or not. And then also it states that the fire board at any time can take up the JPA agreement, review it, make changes, make recommended changes, and then send that to the councils. So we had that discussion, and the conclusion of that discussion was Belmont very much chooses this formula. Belmont very much wants to enter into the 07-08 fiscal year with this budget, with this formula. And by the way, the budget, in all likelihood, I suppose the chief could clarify on this, it may change slightly, but it in all likelihood will stay pretty much the same, because we have that labor agreement which freezes everything for 2 years. We're in one of those years now. We will be in the next year in 07-08. And then we have fixed increases in the third, fourth, and fifth years. So I don't expect to see much change in the budget, because most of the budget is paying for labor. So Belmont would like to move forward with this formula in the 07-08 fiscal year. During that time, what we discussed as a board, fire board, seeing happening in that year is that we would do an audit of the department and look at what are the costs, where are they attributed to, and then during that discussion of the audit, or when we look at an internal operational audit of the department, it could also be tied to the funding, or the funding formula could be tied to that discussion, because we might find things as we do the audit. This makes sense for the funding formula to apply to this in this way. And so at least the Belmont representatives on the fire board were amenable to those kinds of discussions for the future. And the conclusion of that was that might bring about a change in the funding formula. It may not. We may, as we look further at the funding formula and how it operates, be perfectly fine with it and not recommend any changes. So those were the discussions we had. We also talked about liabilities. A little bit of that was discussed tonight. I think, at least in terms of the workman's comp and settlement of personnel issues, we looked at those as being paid for 50-50. Now, when we talk about the PERS and the other things, we didn't get into that. We didn't discuss it. But we did talk about these, and it was a little difficult because some of these things were closed session items, so we couldn't really discuss them. But I think everybody knew what we were talking about, and the conclusion was we would look at those, A, on a case-by-case basis, but B, having done that, in all likelihood, we would look at those as 50-50 to take care of. And the reason we would look at them on a case-by-case basis is because they would have to be highlighted to Thomas Phil in finance, because he's going to have to write the checks. And we didn't want to create something that is so complex that every time he goes to write a check for something, he's got to go look at some index and see, is this to be paid for at 52.48 or 50-50, or how's it to be paid for? And so we don't want to, in trying to follow the dollars, you don't want to create such a tough job that you create expense by trying to follow every dollar and cent. Should also add that during these discussions and during prior discussions, We have talked to the chief about the fees, about reinstituting them. We certainly, as a fire board, want to see that happen. And then Chief Fry has some other areas he would like to discuss with the board about fees and places he can capture some extra dollars. So those things will be coming to the fire board should we go forward to see if we want to institute those. And I would say, some of the things I've had some one-on-one discussions by going to the chief's office and talking to him about some of these things. Some of them sound like very good ideas. I think they're doable. I think there's other areas where we'd want to be careful, just like we are as a council when, the planning department says, we're behind on this fee structure and we're not capturing what it costs. And usually we give direction, well, we want to start capturing that, but we don't want to necessarily capture it all in one leap, because then it looks like too much of a jump. And so I think we would be sensitive if we created any new fees to who would be paying them and how much that might impact those individuals or those business owners or whatever. So I think that concludes the things I would like to say.
Councilmember Griselli?
I don't really have too much to add to what Councilmember Grocott said, except that we've had good discussions. The Belmont City Council designated two different individuals to sit down and speak with us in our December meeting and our January meeting. And as before, we had good, fruitful discussions with them, and I felt everybody got their say and what they wanted to do and what they felt it should be. There really isn't anything, certainly specific questions, and then I'll have some comments later about why we decided to recommend to the City Council why we wanted to do this.
All right. Questions for our commissioners or staff?
It seems like in any formula that we accept the population and assessed valuation component, that San Carlos will just pay more, period. And that I think everybody would agree that those two components are not going to change much. Was there, I guess I got sort of the general impression that there is no formula that doesn't encompass those two components that Belmont would accept. And population and assessed valuation. And that it seemed in watching their city council meeting around the holidays that they were basically in favor of dissolving the department unless those components, or if we get anywhere near 50-50, that they would leave the partnership. Is that sort of the tone in the negotiations? In other words, I guess it doesn't feel like necessarily that there is a full spectrum negotiation on this formula. There's sort of a sense of, well, unless it's in this area, we're not going to play. Is that true?
That's not my impression. My impression was that what they were insisting upon, especially when I look at the full district board, their district board, their city council, they certainly are insistent upon there being a formula. And I would agree with you that they are insistent that it take into account the size of the cities. Now, whether that's assessed valuation, number of parcels, population, whatever those factors are that account for the different sizes of the cities, then yeah, I think you're right. They want something in there that accounts for the fact that San Carlos is a bigger city, and it comes down in terms of population, number of parcels, number of residences, so forth, and even geographic area.
But the population differential, it has no fundamental effect on the staffing and equipment levels. I mean, that's true. There's 25.
It's true to an extent, but it's not.
There's no. I mean, we're both staff, two companies.
Yeah.
So I'm just
let me explain that a little bit. I did attend several of these meetings over the holidays, and as I see it, we're really looking at the recreation of a new institution, a new facility. a new department. And when you look at the department, the purpose of the department is to protect people and property. And when you look at a map, you see that San Carlos is obviously bigger than Belmont in terms of the square miles. I don't have a number on that, but it's just apparent from the map. When we look at the people that we're protecting, we have more people, some 2,500 plus or minus more people. When you look at the property we're protecting, there's no good indication of a count of single-family industrial commercial apartments, but we do have a much higher assessed value. So I think what Belmont is saying is that we need to be realistic about what we're doing with the department. We're protecting people, we're protecting property, we have more of each. Therefore, there must be some way that we can all agree that we should pay a bit more. And, you know, whether you do the four-factor test at 25%, or whether you do some other thing, the reasonable conclusion of it is that we get more, we pay more. Now, it's true that there are 2 stations in each city, and there are 2 companies in each city, and the trucks are the same in each city, and that would argue that there's a 50-50 split. But you can't draw the line separating the 2 cities and say that that's the determinant, because you have to draw a line around the whole thing and then determine within the whole package what has to be covered, what has to be protected, and who has to pay for what. And I think that's the essence of their argument, that we should be paying more. And there was a lot of discussion about what the formula ought to be, and you see them all listed on in your packet, and it could be endless. But sooner or later, at the end of the day, well, what do we do? Well, the Lieberman 2 or the four-factor test seem to prevail.
If I may just add a comment or two, I see the chief here, and I know he wants to say something as well. But just to tag on to Mayor David's comment, they did, in their presentation to their district board, their council, show a myriad of different formulas that are used for JPA agreements in this county. And one of the examples they gave was the library JPA agreement that we have. And Belmont pays less. We both have one library in our cities, but according to that formula, based on the formula with the library JPA, Belmont pays less. And it's because what goes into that formula, I suppose, is population and size of the city and so forth. And that wasn't the only example they gave. They pay less to the sewer joint powers that we have. And there must have been like 5 examples they gave, and in every case, they pay less. So that's their, they're looking at those examples, and that's the angle they take on it.
Just had a follow-up question, because I noticed here in staff report on page 4, they talked about the City of Pleasanton's fire department with the JPA, where I actually quite liked their funding formula. The fire management, which is essentially the fire chiefs, the deputy chiefs, clerical support and all that, each city pays 50%. Fire prevention is charged on the number of inspections. Line administration is charged on the number of fire calls, plus a component on the number of fire companies, in which case it would be 50-50. And then hazmat, well, in our county, is done separately, and that's assessed by the Office of Emergency Services. So I would assume that each would be assessed separately. Was there any consideration given to this type? I mean, it goes completely away from the 25% parcels. I mean, you could argue anyway, and I guess my concern is, again, knowing how San Carlos is going to continue to focus on improvements, I'm assuming that our assessed valuation is going to continue to move up at a faster rate than the Belmont or the properties within the Belmont Fire Protection District. So my fears is that if you base a formula based on doing things the right way, we end up potentially paying more and continuing to pay more, when indeed we may not be getting any, or may not have a higher demand on fire services. And I would prefer to, and I'm not trying to stymie this now, because I certainly appreciate the work that our 2 fire commissioners have done just in kind of looking this over and trying to negotiate something that isn't that would be palatable to both agencies. But at the same time, I still keep going back to the price that we pay into the fire board or the cost of providing fire services ought to be in alignment with the cost of providing services to the city of San Carlos. So if indeed the cost of providing services is greater because of what Mayor David said, it's because we've got more people and we've got more land, then that ought to show up in terms of the actual cost of providing the services and the number of calls and that type of thing. But if we've got 2,500 more people and we're looking at $250,000 increase, that's an additional $100 per person per year, which seems kind of steep.
Chief.
Just a couple of things, if I could clarify. The staffing level for Station 13, because we have the truck down there, is actually 4. So you would have 4 every day at Station 13. We have not had that level at Station 13 because we have an agreement with the labor group in an effort to save some funds, that when we had people on disability, that we did not backfill those positions or rehire for those spots. So for a number of years, we have not had the proper staffing that we should have down at Fire Station 13, which would be 4 on duty every day down there to operate the truck. And I think that's a critical piece. We've saved the money, and for years San Carlos had 3 companies in this town providing a level of service for 25 years, and 2 companies in Belmont, and it just was always 50-50 along the line for them for a lot of years. But I think we're making an effort to try and keep moving forward at being creative and look at other ways of maximizing the personnel that we have. We have multiple pieces of equipment at Station 13. My goal would be at some point is to maximize that piece and do some sort of different staffing opportunities down there to help be creative and make sure we meet the needs for what occurs in both towns. But certainly, the industrial area, having a truck at Station 13 warrants having a truck there because of the activity that you have. If you didn't have that, you'd be paying for truck service probably from some other agency to provide that level for us, which would be an additional cost as well.
So under the Lieberman funding formula, then, if you were to go back and to put that Station 13 back in, San Carlos would end up bearing a significant portion of the cost for that. Is that right?
Probably so, based on
that Lieberman formula.
We're not talking about bringing another company into play now. We're talking about having the proper staffing at the stations. We've been below that. I don't think anything in this component is to bring that company back at this point. We'd certainly like to see that company in the future, but I know that's a piece that we just can't deal with right now. There's too many other things to juggle with the unfunded liabilities, the fleet, reserves, those types of things that we need to deal with. And we haven't even discussed the component with the board, although the board's aware of it. We haven't really gotten into the nuts and bolts of, let's not forget about vehicle replacement, the cost of doing business, of just running and operating the stations and keeping the equipment current. We're 5 years behind in a vehicle replacement program, strictly because we haven't had the funds to deal with that. And we're hoping that through some of these other opportunities I want to work with the board this year is to start realizing some of that and maybe helping to offset some of that.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Conceptually, what I try to go to is just what does fire service cost and what do we need to pay for fire service in San Carlos? By reinstating the inspection fees, it helps offset some of the assessed valuation component of it. Part of what we're talking to tonight is kind of 2 separate things. One is with the firefighters agreeing to take some freeze in salary, and what's the overall nut that we need to pay for the next 12 months, and what's the long-term solution. That's sort of one component. The other component is just this formula, and frankly, for me, it's where I sort of get some conflict when we look at this. The assessed valuation population components of the formula are the ones that are more troublesome for me, just because I look at it as number of companies and cost of service. And it seems like the rest of the formula sort of takes that into account. It seems what's troubling about if we only have those two components, or some of the other things that you guys talked about, is that Belmont pays more and that Belmont doesn't want to pay more. So it's more the formula I have trouble with. I guess from what you said, the formula is something that can be revisited. Is that right? But this is something that obviously you guys don't want to continue to debate ad nauseum on the fire board. So the question for me is, one thing is, what's the right solution for the next year? We don't have a competitive offer from San Mateo or Redwood City. So we don't really have another viable offer, in my opinion, on the table for this. And then what will Belmont accept and stay involved with the GAPA?
You know, to speak to some of your point, I mean, I think all of us on the fire board, and Belmont included, are concerned about the formula. Perhaps ours, San Carlos on one side, Belmont on the other, but everybody's concerned about the formula. I finally stepped over, a couple of weeks ago, I finally sort of stepped back and sort of, as Mayor David said, what does it cost for a fire service? And in today's day and age, and if I'm not with Belmont, if I'm not doing this, where am I, and what am I paying? You could make the case you could have your own fire department. Unfortunately, economies of scale still require 3 battalion chiefs and a chief, which you have now, over 2 situations. So you don't necessarily pick up anything on economy of scale. You look at the dollars of that vis-a-vis going out to contract with San Mateo or Redwood City, and it's very competitive where we're right in the ballpark here. I mean, 100,000 here, 100,000 there, but it's not going to be a whole lot cheaper. The formula is, we're all so wrapped up in it, and I was too, and believe me, the last year I've been extremely wrapped up in it. I finally just stepped away from it. And as Mayor David said, and just said, what is it going to cost? Because I kept saying that to the folks at Belmont. I said, what is the cost? What do you want to pay? And then finally I turned around and asked myself, what do we want to pay for a top-flight fire service? We have a 5-year labor agreement with the fire folks. The first 2 years, 0 increase. The next year, as Councilman Grocott said, are fixed dollars. So we know what our labor costs are going to be coming up. Certainly there's unfunded liabilities. But if we don't have this agreement, we have those unfunded liabilities too. So to me, that's a side, that's off to the side too. We still have to pay them. Along with the same thing with truck replacement, reserves, all those things are there, whether we're standing here or standing there. I've always felt, and I'm sure that we probably would all agree, that the fire service we have has been excellent. It's been good. Together, we're stronger than separate. At least that's my opinion, and that's why I'm recommending that we go this way. And as we said, we can revisit it every 3 years, but we can, as Councilman Grocott said, we're going to be doing an operational audit, looking at some of these items, seeing where other items we might be able to pick up, and we might find out that in a year, this just doesn't work. It just doesn't work, and we feel that we're going to be completely off the charts on our costs, and we can't make it work. But right now, today, as we go out to the marketplace, I think it's a very competitive amount, and we stay together, and we keep the fire service that we have in good order. So that's basically the gut reaction that I have to reason why I want to come up with this, sort of throwing those percentages out, saying what are we getting for our dollar for good and professional coverage and service. And I'm sure there are people in the last few weeks who've all read about our fire service has had a very busy last month in large items. There's been 2 or 3 major fires, as I remember, some accidents and some other things going on. And I've heard and seen nothing but positive things. And those are the kinds of things that I'd like to see happening, people responding on time and the service continuing as it has been with our new employees that we have had added and will be having in the future.
If I can follow up now, you asked a good question, Brad. What does it cost to have fire service in this city? So go look at Foster City, same size as we are, basically. $7.5 million a year, I believe, for fire service. That's what it costs them. We've gotten a good deal out of South County Fire for 27 years. Unfortunately, we didn't take any of that savings when we created South County Fire and suck some of it away for reserves to replace vehicles, to take care of the unknowns and those sorts of things. And we've gotten a really good deal out of South County, and we've, in my opinion, squandered the money. The deal you look at with CDF, let's look at that number, 4.7 million, I believe, was their offer. 7.738 or something. 4.7.
Doug and I were talking about it today. I mean, the number that we reported in November was 3.9. The number that Doug had worked with this morning that took into account accepting all of our officers, or our firefighters rather, was 4.2.
4.2. Okay. Now add to that. There's no BCs in that. There's no fire chief, I believe.
There is an administrative charge in that that does provide for management.
Where's that coming from? Felton?
Well, I mean, again, they've been indicated that they would accept the firefighters from the city, and so the 4.2 assumed that they would accept the employees that are currently employed by the South County Fire. There are 3 battalion chiefs, and the assumption that they had to make, because they were looking at both Belmont and San Carlos, is that 1.5, I think, would be provided in both areas. But if 2 were retained by South County and 1 went to Belmont or vice versa, I mean, they're going to charge you for the cost of providing the service. And so I can't give you an exact figure because we don't know which employees might go one direction or another.
Certainly there's no chief involved, and you might want a deputy chief in town to help run things, unless you're going to expect your police chief or somebody else to do the duties of a chief. You have the hazmat unit. Depending on who stayed and who left, if we went to CDF, you would probably have a period where you couldn't man a hazmat truck because our guys are trained with hazmat. The guys you get from CDF are not necessarily going to be. So our obligation to the county with that contract would all fall into question. You'd still have the unfunded liabilities. You'd still have equipment replacement and trucks and engines and so forth. So it's not free lunch going to CDF by any means. It's not a bad outfit. Don't mean to disrespect CDF, but I don't think the costs of going to CDF are what you think they are. I think bottom line, my opinion, is we've gotten a good deal out of South County Fire. We'll continue to get a good deal out of Belmont San Carlos Fire Department. We'll have good response time, good fire service, and firefighters who care about this community, as they demonstrated on Christmas Eve when 12 families were burned out of an apartment and the firefighters collected $1,200 and went and bought presents and replacement gifts for those folks so they could still have Christmas. Those are the kind of firefighters we have in this town. The assessed value and population portion of the formula, I would agree to an extent with Councilmember Doherty on the Livermore-Pleasanton model. I think it's a good model. And if you look at the formulas that I provided, it's more like that model because about 60% of the cost were 50-50 and were based on things like fire stations, fire companies, employees, and so forth. And I tried to keep that a high number because I do think, yeah, you have to look at the fact that it costs sort of a fixed number to have a fire department, whether you have any calls, any people, any assessed value, or whatever. You got to have, if you have a town, you have to have a fire station, you have to man it, and so forth. And that's something, again, I'd like to have further discussion on the funding formula because of that. I do think, though, assessed value plays a part because if we develop, and we're more likely to develop at a faster pace than Belmont, simply because we're bigger, we have more land, we have more redevelopment projects on the horizon. But what comes with that? Well, property tax comes with it. So the money to the city, your revenue goes up. Are you not going to suggest that we give any of that money to the fire department? I think we should. So we've got more to protect as we develop. We have got more revenue. And yes, I'll admit, one of the reasons Belmont looks at ability to pay is because they have a fire district. And they look right at their fire district and they say, you know what, we raised $5.7 million in our fire district. And San Carlos hasn't ever come close to paying $5.7 million for fire. But they could. And they say, why don't you have the money? Where do you spend it? Because you're getting the property tax. We're getting it in our district. We can see it because it's accounted for. What about you, San Carlos? And that, I'll admit, I think that's part of the thinking that goes on. And I think there's some reasonableness to that thinking because there is a point of ability to pay. And especially as you develop and add properties and the assessed value grows. So that's why I'm willing to go with it. I'm also willing to go with this formula because I think when you just look at the numbers going up and down from just sticking to the formula that went with the assessment, if it had passed, and then the negotiations, you could see where, if reading through the material, you could see where we were negotiating back and forth. I think we settled on something that, it kind of gets to Bob's point. What are you willing to do here, and how much you're willing to pay? And when it comes down to after we take accounting of the fees, which I believe we're already starting to institute, is that right, Chief? So the figure on page 4 of $63,000 is probably not too far off. It might be $100,000. It might, who knows? But I think the thing that we did negotiate into this whole thing was we would take the fees and bring them down under the line, and we would get credit for what we owed based on how much we bring in fees.
Okay, let me just follow up with a few statements. First, I would take exception to Matt's suggestion that the money was squandered. I don't think that's quite correct. Bear in mind that when we did merge the departments, money was saved, and that was general fund money that was used in a different place for a different purpose. The question, which bears to be considered, is that we didn't use any of that money to set up reserves and to put money aside for unfunded liabilities, and perhaps that has put us in a difficult situation today. But we are where we are, and we need to continue in one form or the other. I am prepared to pay more than Belmont because I'm convinced that if we started over again, we would agree to do so. I think we have a bit of an over-focus on what we've been doing for the last 20 or 25 years, and a consideration perhaps that we should do the same, but it's not the same game. We're in a different chapter. We're playing in a different place. Therefore, I think we need to take a fresh look at that. We can continue to look at the possibility of service with outside providers. There's something about that bothers me. We can write a check and not worry about all the detail, but we also have no control. That bill comes every month, and whatever that bill is going to have to be paid. And we can spend all the time that we think is appropriate to try to set up a formula and a schedule of who pays what or how we would pay for service. But believe me, we're going to forget something. We won't cover something. Something's going to happen, and we'll pay our share. And I think that's inevitable. And we won't have anything to say about it. We'll just simply be a receiver of services rather than a group that provides the service. So I think being able to manage the process is important. It's not always very comfortable, and it's not always a lot of fun when you negotiate and determine the final bottom line. But it's appropriate, and it's something I think we need to accept. So I'm prepared to move forward with the four-factor formula that's been proposed. And I would trust that as we do move forward, we would take a good close look at what we do next with some of the undetermined factors. I think that anything that's a liability before fiscal year 07-08 should be a 50-50. It may be a complicated process in terms of determining costs, but I'm sure we can figure that out. The point is that it was incurred during the 50-50 days, and therefore, in my judgment, it ought to continue to be paid on a 50/50 basis, whether it's unfunded liabilities, whether it's worker comp claims, or whether it's some determination that we ought to go back and build a reserve policy prior to the new fiscal year. Whatever happens, it seems to me ought to come under that level. And if it's determined that it can't, we need to have some discussion on that. But apart from that, I would be prepared to move forward.
Excuse me, through the chair, I'd just like to agree that, in my opinion, if current liabilities that we've incurred on the 50/50 model, it'd be my impression that those should stay under the 50/50. I also just want to echo a couple of other things that I think the fire board members, Councilmember Grocott, Councilmember Vasili, you guys have done an amazing job in tenaciously sticking with this over a really difficult course of time, and I appreciate the effort and perspective and all that. So I just want to thank you both for the hard work involved there, and then I also want to thank the firefighters and the chief for everything that they've done over the course of time in trying to work hard to make this a viable situation for both communities. Thanks.
Councilmember Dory?
Yeah, I keep coming back to, I'm having an issue with this assessed valuation and the population, because I continue to try to look to the future, and I do think that unless we've done the analysis to understand where our costs lie, I think we're going to end up hamstringing future development in San Carlos, potentially because of the implication that it has on the cost of providing fire services overall. And I would really like to get more to a management call volume and company basis rather than having anything to do with parcels and population, because I really don't think, or assessed valuation and population, because I really don't believe that the population component is going to be taken into consideration in terms of call volume, because we know that as population goes up, theoretically your call volume is going to go up as well, because there's a certain percentage of population that's going to require calls, and whether they're medical calls or fire calls, that's pretty predictable. So population and call volume actually are basically sort of the same thing, except call volume is a little bit more based on actual cost. And then in terms of assessed valuation, if you think about if indeed we do continue to grow to the point where we actually do need to have additional fire companies, I think that we can, or future councils can make that determination, because part of the formula has to do with the number of fire companies. And if the future council decides that indeed that they would like to, that there is the need from a public safety standpoint or from a call responsiveness standpoint, add an additional fire station or an additional company, future councils have the flexibility to do that without having to go back to the entire fire board and renegotiate the formula to somehow, again, make it so that Belmont doesn't pay more. I take exception with this. Well, Belmont historically has paid less in all other districts. I mean, I don't think you can draw a parallel between the library JPA where Belmont pays less or the sewer JPA. I think that's good negotiating on Belmont's part for, in the past, for negotiations, but I don't look at those for setting precedent whatsoever as we move forward towards looking at how fire costs and payment for fire services are allocated. So, having said that, I am very much in favor of keeping the Belmont and San Carlos Fire Department together, but I'd certainly like to have a funding formula that is not only realistic for what we're doing now, but also gives future councils, of which none of us may be on the council at that point, the flexibility and the ability to do what's right for the city of San Carlos at that point when the need arises. So I don't quite know where to go with this. Again, there's nothing before us that's actually an actual amended JPA agreement, but I would really like to at least see one more analysis, which is what does it look like if it's based on overhead, which, as you pointed out so eloquently, Councilmember Grocott, that it's sorry, I lost my chain of thought. But that, we could look at the cost. I mean, each city has to provide, even if there's no calls, there's a basic cost of providing services to the residents and the businesses. And I think that we need to understand that and split that 50-50, however that works out, because it's the same number of people. And then, again, look at the call volume and look at the fire companies as the other components.
Just in response to that, though, Council Member, when you talk about fire companies, the formula says that the number of fire companies is worth 25% of the entire formula. And currently we have 2 and Belmont has 2. If we were at a 3, we would pay more, but it's still worth only 25% of the total. So there's nothing that says that, as I read this, that we cannot form a fire company. We'll simply pay a little more for it. But that company will be located, let's say, presumably in our industrial area, and will be available for calls in that area, plus their calls throughout the Joint Powers District. So it can be done, and it can be done very economically. So I think that the formula helps that process and is quite equitable to San Carlos when you look at it. And then I would, without belaboring the discussion, I would respectfully state that we're protecting people, and if we have more people, we should be able to pay more. The such valuation is the same. So I don't see a conflict there. I think it's an appropriate determination of how to divide the cost.
Yeah, I think the only conflict arises where, yes, it's in the formula that if we add a station, we pay 25% of that cost, and Belmont pays, or 25% of that. However, the issue becomes that if we want to add a station, then obviously that increases the budget. And in order to get an increased operating budget requires the fire board to both agree on it.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that the JPA is written, it would require 2 votes from Belmont Fire Protection, and it would require at least an additional vote from San Carlos to pass that amended budget.
No, that's not true. To come out of the fire board, it would simply need a tie vote. So it could be split down between the 2 cities. Once that's approved, then it goes to both councils, or their fire district board and our council, and it would take a majority vote in each of those for it to pass. That's the way the budget works.
Right, and
or any changes to the budget.
And again, I didn't mean to imply that the funding formula should be 50% management and overhead and 25% and 25% to get to the 100%. It may be that it's 30-30-30. It may be that it's 20-20-60. I don't know what the right allocation would be, but I just would certainly be interested in kind of a slightly different spin at this. And, maybe the fire board members could say that they don't see that's ever going to pass, because in that scenario that potentially Belmont ends up paying not quite so less, or maybe paying a little bit more. I don't know.
Well, through the chair, we spun this thing 1,000 ways. I personally have done 25 different variables. And it's an amazing thing when you can do with an Excel spreadsheet. It doesn't take that long to do. And we've talked about probably 20 of them at the fire board meeting. We've spun this thing. We've got something on the table here. I don't know whether to call the question or we need public input or whatever. I'm not mean to usurp the mayor's thing, but we've talked about this, and we've talked about it for a whole year now. And I think we owe it to the people, and we owe it to the firefighters, both, and even to ourselves, to make a decision one way or the other way. And it may not be the right decision, and it may be the best decision, but it's a decision. And I think it's time to do that and try to move on and see if we can sort of put this in a situation where we can, as Councilmember Grocott put it, fine-tune it, as opposed to decide whether we're going to be together or not. And that's really, I think, the bottom line question is, do we want to be together or not? And so I don't know if whatever the procedure is for calling the question, if we need public input, that's fine. I just feel like we've talked this, and again, no disrespect to Councilwoman Teagle Doherty, but we have spun this thing with a million different variations. And this happens to be the one that right now is the favorite that we came up with, and that's sort of where at least two of us are standing. So, again, I share your concerns about some of those items, but they were debated, at least at the fire board level, and this is what we came up with.
Through the chair.
So, yes, go ahead. Before we ask for public comment, if there is any, we'll conclude our council discussion. Go ahead, Matt.
I'm dismayed that we don't have anything here to take action on. So are we just going to show by consent a direction?
It would be my suggestion that we move to approve the percentage that was recommended at the fire board, and any other fire board matters that you think should be a part of this motion can be added to it.
Very good.
That would be the cornerstone.
Okay, thank you.
So any from the public would like to help us out? Yes, ma'am. Please give your name.
My name is Michelle Bachulupi, and I'm a resident here in San Carlos. And hello again. And I wasn't here tonight to comment on this, but I'm really struck by this conversation. And I want to appreciate your detailed view. You know, obviously I don't know much about the Livermore or Pleasanton, but that sounds most appealing in terms of actual cost of services. Without knowing more detail, I have to say that we're talking about 4 points. Now, which one of us would take an interest loan that has 4 points more in interest versus 4 points less? You know, your diff between 58, 57, and 52. The part that really concerns me, okay, we have a bigger city. All right, okay, that feels okay to pay a little more. We have a few more people, a couple thousand. I can live with that. But to say that based on assessed value that goes up and down, that can be inflated, that can be manipulated, that a home in Belmont is not worth as much as a home in San Carlos, when a family is a family, whether they lose a home or someone loses a business, and that feels really wrong to me. And I happen to agree that Belmont just may have some really good negotiators, not that we're not smart and bright and capable, but so that they've negotiated good deals for themselves. Well, good for them, absolutely. But to use it based on assessed value, I just think that's really wrong-headed, and I think it's sort of succumbing to we're in a bind. There's no one else out there. This is the best that we can get. Again, I can live with we're a bit bigger. We have a few more people. I still prefer the more detailed perspective. But assessed value, I think that needs to come off the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Pat Bell?
Pat Bell, San Carlos, and I have sat through the discussion of all those 20 alternatives, and I want everyone to know that our negotiators have done a fine job, as have the Belmont Fire Board members, and I want to thank Mr. Lieberman for the work he's done since came onto the Fire Board under a lot of heat, and has really done an excellent job. It's too late to look at Livermore Pleasanton. I think our staff should have looked at Livermore Pleasanton a year ago. They didn't do that. There's too much water under the bridge. This is it. I agree with Councilmember Gracilli. We have to decide now to do this. The citizens of San Carlos support our fire department. Measure I came very close to a 2/3 majority 3 years ago, even with Mr. Grocott campaigning actively against it. We had a council election last year, and the 3 candidates who ran supporting the fire department, including Mr. Grocott, won the election. We had an assessment vote this year, and it failed, but it did not fail when you look at the homeowners in San Carlos. They voted for it. They passed it. We don't know what the vote would have been if all of the citizens in San Carlos had been allowed to vote, but we do know what happened with Measure I. We do know what happened in the council election. We know what happened in the assessment election as far as the homeowners in San Carlos. They have told you over and over, we want this fire department to succeed and to continue. And the question now is, are we going to continue? I went to the information meetings about the assessment, and I did not hear citizens talking about the formula and the retiree medical and the blah, 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 blah. It just wasn't there. They weren't talking about it. I've heard they didn't understand the formula. Okay, Warren's come up with a real simple formula, 25, 25, 25, 25. You can't understand that? You're going to have to get out of the game. It doesn't get much simpler. They've looked at formulas that had a gazillion pieces. Thomas juggled the pieces all over the place in that spreadsheet. And it still comes down to, are we going to have local control? Are we going to support our fire department, which has supported us so well, which has stood by us through all this upheaval for years? Guys who got laid off 3 years ago have come back to work for this fire department. I don't know why, when it was still in turmoil, but they care about our community enough to come back and work for us again. And we owe them, and we owe the citizens of San Carlos, a decision tonight to go forward and to agree with Belmont and to work with Belmont to make this fire department whole and to have it continue to serve our communities, our two communities. I think our fire board members have done an excellent job. I think the Belmont fire representatives, both Dave and Coralyn last year and Warren and Phil this year, are willing to work with us. They want to save the fire department. And all this bickering over what goes into the formula is political, has nothing to do with the citizens. It has to do with, are they going to get the better of us? And I don't want to vote for something if they're going to get the better of us. Well, darn it, that's what it costs. Mr. Gracilli is absolutely right. You want to write a check, and Mr. David said the same thing. You want some outside agency to send you a bill every month, and you pay it? And you don't have anything to say about it? Or do you want to work with Belmont and keep our fire department going forward? That's what the citizens want. I have not heard one citizen stand at this podium and say, CDF sounds like a good idea to me. So the bottom line is, we have Mr. Lieberman's formula, which our fire board members have agreed to, or we have CDF. And I don't think you have any support for CDF.
Thank you. Sally Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. I have a couple of questions that I would appreciate answers to, and I'm speaking tonight in my individual capacity only, and mostly as a very passionate former fire inspector of the city. I would like an explanation as to why I actually was involved in instituting the fees in 1977 or 78, and when I was the only fire inspector in the entire department. And I know how much we raised in those days. I'm interested in knowing why the decision was made to discontinue the fees, which apparently have lost somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000 in the last 2 years.
Okay. That's the first question.
I can give you an answer. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the chief can chime in if he cares to. That was a decision made by Chief Loudon, and the current fire board had nothing to do with it, and I think it was almost made just by him alone, partly because he saw the dissolution of the department in the future, and just made a decision to not charge for those inspections. I think there was also some aspect to, during the Measure I campaign, to not create political, to do it for political purposes. And I can't say that was right or wrong, but that's a decision that was made. Chief, do you have any? That's correct. So there you go.
Okay, and those are the only reasons. There wasn't any legitimate business reason, or
no.
And the fire board was not at all involved.
Well,
certainly I wasn't involved, having come on last year, Ms. Mitchell.
Right. No, I understand that.
No, and I don't know whether the fire board was involved before that, because we weren't there, in those meetings. So I don't know whether.
I'm assuming that some kind of study has been done, some investigation has been made into this, and that you would know that.
I'm sorry, I don't.
Okay. The other inquiry I have is how this council feels about not having a fire engine at Station 13, and why we should consider paying more than Belmont when they have 2 engine companies and we have 1.
But we also have a truck company, and they have no truck. So
well, the truck that happens to be at 13 services the entire authority, or now department. Engines do things that trucks can't do, and I'm assuming that the fire board members know the difference, the far greater impact that an engine has than a truck in virtually every call.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to know, as a citizen of San Carlos, why we have no fire engine.
Again, that was a decision made by the previous fire board. The previous fire board chose. They had that discussion, and they made that decision to put in San Carlos the truck and not the engine. Now, I suppose as a future consideration of this current fire board and of this council, we could begin discussions about whether or not we want to give up truck service altogether so that we can have an engine downtown and an engine out on the Alameda and not have a truck. The discussions we had as a fire board before the assessment, and as part of the assessment, was going to pay for what we called a, Chief, what's the term? Not blended company, but cross-staffed company. And the idea was to hire a few extra firefighters that we could keep at Station 13, and depending on the call from dispatch, we could either send out the truck or we could send out the engine. And that's what we were hoping for. That was going to be one of the items paid for by the assessment. The assessment failed. We can no longer look at doing that until we find increased revenues somewhere else. And perhaps we go out for another assessment for that very reason. But we've had that discussion. We recognize the issue. We sit here with working out the best with what we have.
Is there any desire on the part of the council members to have a fire engine servicing our citizens?
I think there absolutely is, and in fact, it would be nice to maybe move the truck back and forth if that's even feasible to do, so that, or look at an additional engine. But then, of course, the budget numbers, the costs go up, and that would have to be agreed to by both city councils, I would imagine. And given the current situation, I don't know that would pass. I think it would pass on this.
I think it would be a desirable thing. However, I'm not personally that aware of what the truck can do that the engine can't, or vice versa. I do know that the truck goes out on many calls. It goes by my backyard continually. It's out there doing something, and perhaps it can't do everything, but it's going. It's dispatched. It's doing its work. So I don't know, Sally, whether it's.
If I may speak to that, on medical calls it makes no difference whatsoever, except that you're taking out a very large piece of equipment for a medical call, which is why you see the truck in front of the Elms all the time. But a truck is a big toolbox with ladders and other things. An engine carries water and hoses and those kinds of things. So if you're putting out a fire, you need an engine. I will say this, though. It's primarily an issue of response time, because we do have an engine. Belmont has their engines out on Ralston that would probably answer a call to our industrial area. But we also have the drop boundary situation, and so we always get, we would get an engine from somewhere. It's just a matter of how long it takes to get there and where it's coming from according to, the way dispatch sends it out. And there's also another component here that now we have in this county, which is anytime we have a structure fire, you get backup BCs, and you get backup engine, and you get backup truck. Am I correct on that, Chief? Correct.
Yeah, I think the runtime on an engine from another station, and I'm just guessing about this, in the olden days we had 6 fire stations between the 2 cities and 2 trucks. But my guess is that the runtime for an engine dispatched from another station would not arrive within the standards that the community has set for it itself. And it just seems to me that with no fire engines serving our people who are served by Station 13, and with Belmont having more runs than we do, to be contemplating this, although it sounds as if there are already 3 votes for San Carlos to pay more, it seems kind of skewed to me at this point. And finally, I'd just like to point out that as I read the agenda, this is not an action item tonight. So I would ask that you consider that. Thank you.
Brian Randolph.
My name is Brian Randall. I live in San Carlos. Mr. Mayor, council members. Our current fire service has served myself and my family admirably. We can say firsthand they are the best. They have proven themselves. Please do not risk losing them. Thank you.
I'm sorry, anyone else like to speak? I'd like to go back and refer to the city attorney on next steps. Ms. Mitchell suggested that our agenda doesn't allow action. Under the alternatives presented to the council, discuss the option of changing the funding formula for fire services and elect to amend the JPA to use a revised funding formula with or without the proposed reinstatement of fees and general fund revenue transfer. Does this allow us, Bob, to take a vote?
Mr. Mayor, with all due respect to former Mayor Ms. Mitchell, the agenda, which indicates consideration of changes, is expressly on there for the purpose of discussion and electing to make changes. And if you look at the staff report, it says discuss the option of changing the formula and elect to make change in 3 different options to the council. Unlike the item 9, for example, which is a study session that just says to discuss revenue alternatives. So, yes, the agenda is clear enough for you to make.
We can make a motion and move things along. Okay. Any further discussion at the council level?
Actually, I just have just for clarification, so we're not taking any position then on the unfunded liabilities at tonight's meeting?
Well, we don't have a motion presented to us, but I expressed my preference that I felt that everything incurred in terms of cost prior to the new fiscal year should be on the 50-50 basis. And I would suggest that the maker of the motion include that in the motion. I think that's fair in terms of taking care of the past situation and opening a new chapter.
May I comment to that,
Yes.
Mr. Mayor? There is a complexity to the unfunded liabilities, both with retiree medical and with PERS, because some of those liabilities are attributed to employees who indeed work for the department and then retired, and they are being paid their retirement and their both their PERS, and they're being paid their medical. Then you have employees who are current, who at one time were paying in at 2.5 at 50, and now we've made a promise to them to pay them at 3 at 50 when they retire, and they are current employees, and they will continue to be current employees until such time as they choose to retire. So you've got something that's a little bit, it would take some work to slice and dice that and decide how much of that is from the past, how much of it is current operation that you owe for. Because all PERS does is say, PERS says you went from 2.5 at 50, you're now 3 at 50, and we've got to make up for that 5% or 0.5% that wasn't paid in by anybody over those years.
But isn't that a factor that you can plug in on a per person basis and know what that amount is?
I suppose.
50/50?
I suppose, but you'd also have to look at, their current pay-in, what they're paying in currently, what they paid in the past, come up with that difference, and figure all that out. It takes some work, but I suppose it could be done.
All right, anything else for our commissioners? Would either of you gentlemen like to make a motion so that we can move this forward?
I'll make the motion to amend the Belmont San Carlos Fire District JPA to use a revised funding formula with the 25% formula for the year beginning July 1st, 2007.
And would you include a statement regarding workers' comp and other
The difficulty, I don't think it'll pass, so it's sort of moot. If I don't include it, it won't pass. But having said that, I always considered this like Social Security, and I don't know how you can break. I'm a numbers guy, and I guess anything can be done, but I think that could be a real difficult number, even though in principle I agree with the concept that old is old and new is new. But to be able to do that, I'm not sure how we're going to go after it. But I'll make the motion with saying, as Mayor Davids has requested, for the sake of getting the vote out, that I will make that motion, adding on that we try to identify the past liabilities and have it done on a 50/50 formula, if that's possible to even do. I really don't know if it is, but if it is, I would again, we won't have the vote. I don't think I can count the third vote there unless we have that. So that's my motion.
So we have a motion, a strong first part. And
I'll provide a second. Can we have some discussion after?
Yes, certainly.
As procedure?
All right.
Okay, I'll provide the second.
Councilmember Grocott seconds the motion, and now discussion.
I'll jump right in there with the discussion, and that is, we did discuss this at the fire board about past liabilities, and I think if maybe Mr. Lieberman would like to correct me. I just want to make sure I'm correct on this, that we discussed it as a fire board, and we left it open for discussion. Now, there were some pretty strong opinions about it, but am I correct, Bob, that we did have it as an item of discussion? We talked about it, but I don't think, when we made a motion to amend, make a recommendation to this council, we didn't discuss the past liabilities or anything like that.
I know some of the past liabilities we said we would take as they came up, but I'm not sure, because of the fact that in our budget we are paying right now for the PERS.
Right.
It's a difficult thing for me to say that you're going to break that out, because now you're going to break out part of your operational budget, and that's the.
Can I ask a question? Excuse me. If we're going to go with San Mateo or Redwood City, there's consideration at some point that those liabilities would be separated out, right? So how is, Mr. Weiss, do you recall how that was going to be approached?
Yeah, I mean, PERS has done a calculation and determined what the liability is. And they would set up a payment formula for you to pay it as a side fund. And you can do that with pension obligation bonds and even pick a different time frame to pay that obligation off. And so there is an accounting mechanism that would allow you to do that if philosophically you chose to do that. Obviously, both parties would need to agree, but it would, there's an identifiable amount. Currently, that amount is paid through the operating budget, just like the city, just like the fire department. But you could segregate out what portion of the PERS payment is for that unfunded liability and pay it separately. And so just a portion of your budget moving forward would be segregated, and you'd pay a portion of the budget for 50-50, and the rest of the budget you'd be paying for 52-40.
That sort of meets my understanding. Mayor Davids, is that sort of your general understanding?
Well, and I think it's something we, again, as a fire board, we could discuss. I would point out we're talking about, if I read our staff report correctly, we're talking about a nut of $480,000. And part of that nut, if I read this correctly, we've already talked about as a fire board that on some of these things like settlement of personnel and workers' comp claims, I think we had a pretty good understanding at the fire board that in some of the cases we have even pending right now, those are things that occurred in the past. They're easily identifiable, unlike PERS. Like I told you, the PERS thing could be complex, but these things we can identify easily. And I think what we had at the fire board was, 50-50. It happened in the past. It's fine. So what you're asking us to do, I think, as your two fire board representatives, is to go back and look at this PERS element and retiree medical element and discuss it even with Thomas Phil and our staff. How difficult is this? If we're down to, after we get rid of these workman's comp claims and so forth, if we're talking $380,000, at what point does it?
You quit talking and
do you
pay,
quit talking and just pay? Right.
Well, I understand the complexity. I really don't, but I appreciate the fact there is such.
I don't either.
Wait,
and I'm willing to.
Chair, for clarification, so of the $1.3 million that's in the budget and future budgets, that would be that the chief was talking about to pay down that medical over 11 years.
That's PERS over 11 years.
PERS over 11 years. That's for past, and so that 1.3 would be split 50-50, or that 1.3 million would be split 40, whatever it is, 47-53 or 48.
This is what I'm saying. You have to look at who's employed now, who's not employed anymore, who are we paying already, who are we paying for in the future, and so forth. It gets complex. The chief will. Well,
the 1.3 is a combination of what Commissioner or council member, whatever we are this week, Grocott said. So you have to break it out. It's not that easy. It's not just 1.3 and you say, well, that's past, because you're paying for current, just like Social Security.
No, I understand. But, we keep hearing that there's somewhere an unfunded liability of somewhere between, what's the number, 15 and 19 million?
Right.
It keeps jumping all over the place.
Right.
And so that 15 to 19 million ought to be documented and ought to be allocated at 50-50, and each city ought to figure out how they want to pay that unfunded liability.
Not that simple.
But it isn't that simple. I wish it was, because I'd do it for you in 5
minutes. There are employees right now that we're paying 47% PERS rate. That's on current employees. Part of that 47% is paying for the fact that we went from 2.5 to 3 at 50.
Chief, do you have any input to clear this up?
Well, I think there was some discussion, as Councilmember Grocott stated, that on some of the things, it was going to stay at a 50-50 split based on the piece of it. I think there's more discussion that needs to occur about the longer-term objectives. Mm-hmm. What we talked about specifically was some things that were going to be coming up in the near future, probably before the next fiscal year. And I think we just need to continue on and have that discussion. Certainly, to talk about the PERS piece and back out 1.3 million out and talk about that thing is probably something that can be done, and set that aside however we want to do that. But I think that is further discussion that'll probably be Wednesday night once we move forward with this piece. The other thing to remember, too, is January 1, you started with a new retirement system for the fire. So new employees that are hired after January 1 will fall under a different retirement plan as well. So that number could be completely different for future, assuming we go forward and bring new personnel and fill the vacancies that we have in the future. We've eliminated the disability pieces as of the end of the year. We have no other employees on disability that we've been waiting to deal with. They are off the books. They are done. So we've eliminated that piece. So we should start to see some savings along that piece. But it's been a long process to get those people off the books as well. But I think we'll start to see some upward swing in that.
That sounds like it may be premature to actually try to incorporate Mayor David's desire to get unfunded liability.
Well, they're going to try. I can accept a good try, understanding the complications of trying.
So I suppose, if I may, Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
The motion could drop that element, but you've given us very strong direction as your two fire board members to go in and talk about that piece and negotiate it.
Would that be more comfortable for you?
Yes.
So restating the motion, Robert?
What am I doing?
Without the trailer?
Without the trailer, I'll make the motion without the trailer to I didn't think it would pass. Discuss the option of changing the funding formula and elect to amend the JPA to use a revised funding formula to 25, 25, 25, 25.
And is that motion seconded?
Second.
May we have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Grocott?
Yes.
Councilmember Grisilli?
Yes.
Councilmember Lewis?
Yes.
Councilmember Teagle Doherty?
Yes.
Mayor Davids?
Yes.
However, I would like to state for the record that it's not that I'm opposed to the firefighters. I'm very supportive of the firefighters, and in that interest, I pass this. However, I would like to note that, or strongly encourage, when our 3-year review comes up, that we really take a good, long, hard look at future costs.
And I think you'll find that happen before 3 years.
Well, thank you all for that lively discussion and for the audience as well. We're going to move along now to item 8C, which is authorization to release request for proposal and preparation of citywide storm drainage master plan. Mr. Parviz.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, in this request for proposal, we have identified the areas that have been flooded, susceptible to flooding, and have been designated by FEMA as being in the 100-year flood zone. At the same time, we will give the consultants the area that the staff knows that there is flooding issue, not a major flooding issue, but the streets like 900 block of Elm, for example, that during the heavy storm, the water gets up to the curb and on the sidewalks. And there are other locations that there are localized problems that we will identify, give the consultants to review and come up with a design. And at the same time, we have included in the RFP all possible alternatives for creek stabilization and preservation. There are a lot of different methods of doing all of that, and it would require the consultants to walk all the creeks, take pictures, and identify the eroded areas, curb areas, velocity areas. There's very complicated issues on the creeks, and come up with the fee that they would propose to identify and come up with the design of each one of those alternatives. Very, very, very complicated plan, and either now or after the proposal are presented to the City Council can and may delete some portions of the proposals. When the proposals come, the City Council does not have to award contract based on everything that is in the proposal. For example, if a proposal comes that is very expensive and you would feel that it's really not necessary at this time, you can delete that portion of the proposal at that time. With that, I'll try to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions for Parviz?
Yeah, I just had one, and it actually has to do more with the cross-jurisdictional
exclusions,
Yes.
is what it sounds like. Because a couple of years ago, we were talking with City Council of Redwood City at the same time, because we do have some flooding issues or common boundaries, especially the creek behind, that runs between San Carlos and Redwood City, and then also on the north end, the creek that is fed by the hills from Belmont that then subsequently goes through the Harbor Industrial, or the San Carlos Industrial area down there. Is there a reason why we precluded those, or is it just from this particular RFP that we've precluded them, and there's a plan to look at cross-jurisdictional under another RFP, or how are we going to sort of address some of those issues?
No, for example, Cordilleras Creek that is between San Carlos and Redwood City. But we will ask the consultants when they're doing the creek assessment that they assess both sides of the creek and separate the fee for every side of the creek. And when that proposal comes, we will present that to Redwood City. And if the Redwood City is willing to sign a contract and pay their share, that part of the Cordilleras Creek will be studied and done. If they are not willing to do that, will be eliminated. Because, of course, San Carlos is not going to be paying for a portion that is in Redwood City. And I have contacted Redwood City engineering staff and city engineer, and we have discussed that. And depending on the fee, they will present that to the city council when it comes to see if Redwood City is willing to participate.
So is the Redwood City Council aware of this proposal and that it's coming, or is it simply that you've been working with the engineers up till now, and after it comes back, then at that point it may go to council?
As far as I know, City Council of Redwood City is not aware, but San Carlos City Engineer and his staff are aware, and they're going to wait for the proposal from consultants to arrive, and that will, of course, I'll send them the copy, and then they present that to Redwood City Council and ask for a decision.
Okay. Actually, just through the chair, Mayor Davids, if this does go forward, I would suggest that perhaps we consider an ad hoc committee with some Redwood City Council members as well, because I know that it's come up before as an issue, and I think that in order to move this forward and to try to get some traction, we should probably get the councils at least talking about it sooner rather than later. I think we've taken the initiative to try to get the information in the first place to identify the hot spots, but I certainly do think that this is something that probably is going to require a little bit higher up level support.
I don't think, though, that we want to defer what we're doing until some other city gets on board.
No, agreed, but certainly in conjunction with this.
Yeah.
I believe, of course, your idea is perfect, and that should be done. But I would think the best time will be when the proposal is ready, because the ad hoc committee, when you start meeting, so the question again, what are we going to do in Cordilleras Creek? This is going to be a very complicated project, because you're on private property the first time, on both sides. What are you going to do on private property? What are you going to do? You're going to acquire easements. You're going to acquire property. It's really complicated. Once we have the details, and of course the staff, and I will work with Redwood City engineering staff to summarize what can be done, and that's a really good time to have ad hoc committees to start meeting and talk about it before we sign the contract with the consultant.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions for Parviz?
Yes, I do.
Yes. Matt?
Parviz, what I was trying to figure out from reading both your staff report on the, or actually the request for proposal that you have here, and then reading the comments by the flood committee that we have, I think I understand what they're after, and I agree with what they're after. So I'm trying to find out if your RFP actually does that or doesn't do it. It seems to me what they're after is, let's not just focus on the problem areas. Let's look at the whole city as a watershed, and in fact, let's go beyond the city because, as Councilmember Doherty pointed out, just because the creeks are in our city doesn't mean that's the watershed. The watershed, in one case, is all of Belmont, or a good portion of Belmont. In the other case, to the south of us, it's City of Redwood City and County of San Mateo. And she's right. At one point, I was meeting with the guy who's now an assembly member, Ira Ruskin, when he was on their council, and we got together, and Rose Jacob Gibson from the county, and we got some staff together and had a meeting, and didn't really go anywhere, but we tried. But that was recognizing that the watershed is larger than even our city. And I think what the committee was asking was, let's look at the watershed. Yes, we will identify problems and try to solve those, but you don't solve the problems by just looking at where the problems occur. You solve the problems by looking at the whole watershed. Is your RFP asking these guys to look at the whole watershed or not?
I understand. We've done all of that. The watershed has been studied. The runoff from the watershed for Pulgas Creek and Corderas Creek has been identified, calculated. Redwood City and County paid for it. I was involved in that. Those are all already has been done. So it's in the RFP that we will provide those documents to the consultants. All of that is done, but the thing that we're not asking consultants, what should we do with the watershed outside of the city? I don't think we want to do that because the City of San Carlos should not pay for that unless there is an agreement that between the county and Redwood City and all agencies involved that we want to go ahead and take care of the watershed. That watershed, the issue is the runoff. It's the hydrology of the watershed. That has been done. It's been studied. We have all the data that is necessary. Now that this volume of water, this kind of velocity coming down Corderas Creek and the city portion of the streets and the roof drains, everything is connected to a system that goes Corderas Creek. Those are all the watershed of Corderas Creek. That has been identified, has been studied. Now what to do with Corderas Creek, so the Corderas Creek will have the capacity or stop the erosion, stop the eroded materials. Those are all the issues that these consultants have to consider. But the watershed study has been done. For Pulgas Creek, watershed study has been done. Again, the only thing we're not asking consultants to do, what should we do in the watershed? For example, should we go in the county area and stop looking at the areas that are branches of Corderas Creek, try to stop the erosion there? We're not asking consultants to do that because, again, that's the county. We want consultants to tell us what to do in the city, but at the same time, because Corderas Creek solution, the section that is in the city, involves the Redwood City, we can't stop the erosion on one side of the creek bank and not to stop on the other side. So that's the issue that the Redwood City has to come on board if we're going to do anything in Corderas Creek from almost Edgewood Road coming down to all the way to 101 and Industrial Road. And like Belmont Creek, the watershed study has been done. All of it, all the runoff, 99.9% of runoff approaching Old County Road comes from Belmont. That study has been done. And are we going to get Belmont involved in there? Belmont doesn't have any problem with Belmont Creek. Belmont Creek problem is in Harbor Industrial Area, which I have to ask the county, is the county willing to participate? No response from the county. Of course, Public Works Director retired, so maybe by the time they have a new Public Works Director, something will happen. So the watershed studies have been done. We don't want to duplicate that. Cities and the county have paid a lot of money, and I was involved in the study of all of this watershed, and all the data is available.
Yeah, that was not clear in the staff report that was available. Is another concern that the FLUC has is that there are two issues that seem to be treated separately and there doesn't seem to be any asking of the consultant to address how these interrelate, and that is the flood prevention and then creek preservation.
When we talk about drainage, there are two scientific issues, hydrology and hydraulics. And the engineers, hydrologists, and hydraulic specialized engineers cannot even work without putting these two together. And what we are providing to the consultants, there's a lot of documents that we have to provide to consultants. The entire city drainage system, with all the catch basins, all the pipes, all the sides of the pipes, where they're discharging to, which in all the 4 creeks, they're being discharged to 4 creeks. They have to have all of that to be able to determine how much water is going there. And those are the data will be provided to the consultant. It's not something for example, the flood committee to review all of that. It's too much technical issues for them to review. But hydrology and hydraulics cannot be separated. That's what they're talking about.
They're saying that it can't be separated. Are you saying that
They're saying it looks like it's separated based on what is not separated. It cannot be separated.
Okay, so they'll be dealt with together.
Yes.
All right. And then I was looking at, I did get my hands on the, I don't know if anybody else got this, but the RFQ that was for the Integrated Watershed Management Plan.
Right.
It was mentioned in their report, but it says, well, in our staff report, you gave us a copy of Flux comments, and they say, finally included with this letter is an RFQ for consultant services to develop an integrated watershed management plan for Pilarcitos Creek in San Mateo County.
Right.
So I managed to get a copy of that, and there are some things in here that I don't see in the RFP. For instance, the ecological assessment of stream riparian zones.
Really, it does not apply here. That watershed in that creek, as you can see, is an RFQ only for one section of one creek, and it has a lot of environmental issues in there. Really, what they're going to do there does not apply here, but at the same time, we're asking the consultants, whatever they're recommending, they use bioengineering. And when we talk about bioengineering includes what they're going to do there, but not part of all the management, everything to do. For example, trout, they're talking about preserving the trout. That's not what we have here. It's really completely separate project. But using bioengineering and doing the creek assessment will do what they're going to do there to a certain extent, to the extent that is necessary for these creeks.
I suppose we can discuss that as a council, whether we want this watershed management plan to include ecological restoration of our creeks. So we can discuss that when we get to discussion. We can talk about that.
But I like to emphasize, once the consultants recommend what has to be done to the creeks to preserve the creeks, then you talk about water management without doing what is going to be recommended. To, for example, to remove the concretes, to install plants, to stop erosion, all of that. Then you can talk about water management. Without doing all of that is in this RFP that consultants are going to propose, there is really no need to talk about the water management. Once you see that report, and if that what they recommend is going to be implemented, then you need a water management plan to go with the implementation of what they're going to recommend.
Another thing that's in here is groundwater resources. Is that information that already comes from that study that was done on the whole watershed then? Did we look at that?
Not that the groundwater, all the watershed study that has been done, all the surface runoff from the watershed that gets into the creeks. What they're talking about
groundwater is different than groundwater. Groundwater can be because we're near the bay, and the bay impacts our water table. Right?
Exactly. They would deal with the groundwater if they're going to recommend a design for removing properties along industrial or other flood zone. We're going to get into groundwater. If we talk about constructing retention basins, groundwater there is at about only 6 feet, 5.5 feet, that's when if we're going to excavate during industrial area properties to construct, for example.
We're going to look at groundwater as part of this. We're not going to map it. We're not going to know where it is, where the tides affect it, and so forth.
It's all, if we're going to construct anything that has the water table has an impact on it. If we're not going to do anything that we're going to get to the groundwater, there's no need to study it.
Parviz, isn't it true also that the groundwater tables exist in the county? Because I know in the past from doing some environmental work that, I mean, they know where the groundwater levels are, and they.
Sure.
In fact, there's whole maps of the groundwater. It's almost like underground lakes where they go in at different depths, and so that's been documented. I'm not quite sure what impact that would have.
Exactly. If, as I said, if we're going to go from halfway between Old County Road and Industrial Road towards Highway 101, and we want to try to design something that requires excavation, you're dealing with groundwater.
But we also have groundwater we would want to know about. For instance, the Black Mountain Spring basically goes through this town and goes underneath all those houses that are on Cherry Street on the east side. Every one of those houses, you go in the crawl space, wet all the time. Why? Because there's a spring through there. That's groundwater. We don't want to know that?
No, because you'll be spending millions and millions of dollars to determine. There is water from all the hillsides of San Carlos. There is water. The houses that are below the hillsides, they all have sumps and pumps in the basements. And there are drainage systems around the houses. You want to study that on the private property and what you're going to do with it, I really recommend you don't want to do that.
Okay. And the last question has to do with, they do talk about, again, in the FLUC report, about land use planning and also the assessment of the creeks so that planning staff can work with FLUC on the setbacks. And that's not included in the RFP either.
Setback is an environmental issue and is a planning issue that can be done. Actually, planning director has recommended that separate consultants have to be selected and sign contract with. They've done that in the past to come up and say, okay, they will review how much the setback should be along Cordilleras Creek or Belmont Creek, or for what reason. You have to look at the live plants or the areas and come up with that ordinance recommendation for an ordinance. Doesn't have anything to do with what they're going to do for the creek assessment. Creek setback requirements are really.
Well, what they're saying in here is just an in-depth knowledge of the condition of the creeks. There's not a reason we shouldn't include that in the RFP?
Again, because
they're going to be walking the creek and going through it and photographing it anyways, aren't they?
Yeah, these are mostly, there are hydrology, hydraulics engineer, and bioengineering specialists. The setback requirement requires environmental consultants and biologists. It's really a separate issue.
Well, then the companies that you do have responding, like BKF, they have a tag-along company to provide other expertise. What kind of expertise are they providing?
As I said, to do anything, improvements in the creeks using bioengineering, which is using biology and engineering. They're specialized in creek bank stabilization, planting on the creek banks, but the creek setback depends on how much people want to enjoy this area, how much plants are there that are related to the creek, how many other animals are there that are related to the creek. That's a really environmental study that is completely different than this, and it has been done. There is a report actually in the city.
I do understand what Councilmember Grocott was talking about here. When I read the Fluke comments and the RFP, I've been trying to sort of disentangle what is and isn't going to happen. And it seems like in your response to comments in number 2 under solutions for erosion and sediment control in all 4 creeks using bioengineering tells me that they have to do some condition of the creek study or they're not going to know what level of erosion sediment control needs to take place or has happened or whatever. What I know you're anxious to get on this. My sense is that the conditions of the creeks is going to be studied, but when it gets to setback, which is different issues of how many footage and how many feet back from the edge of the creek and so forth, is something that planning is interested in taking up down the road. But I was, when I first read the comments, I kind of went, well, wait a second, how are you going to do this without studying the conditions of the creeks? And I think you are studying the conditions of the creeks in this, if I read the RFP correctly.
Correct. As you said correctly, that issue of setback is what they do here, these consultants. They recommend what to do in the creek up to top of the creek bank.
The top of the bank.
Right. The setback requirement is from top of the bank inside the properties. That's a completely different issue.
I don't necessarily want to get into discussion because that comes later, Brad, but you're honing in on my concern, which is that all this does is look at how to solve the flood problem. My opinion, I don't want to just solve the flood problem. I want to know about our watershed. And solving the flood problem will come from that, hopefully, but I really want to look at the watershed and the condition of the creeks, and I do think we want to look at the environmental aspect of the creeks.
So
as
why
part of the solution.
don't we begin that discussion?
I'm sorry,
Let's have
this
more
does not
specific-
solve the flooding problem. Creek stabilization and preservation does not have to do, it related to flood control, but is not for flood control. We're talking about not putting any concrete anymore in the creek, not building steel retaining walls in the creek. Use bioengineering to stop the erosion, stabilize the banks. That's, even though it's related to flood control, but it's not flood control. Creek stabilization by itself is not flood control.
I must be
It
missing
helps.
something because it talks
That's
about...
why I have separated flood control, flood prevention with creek stabilization.
Why don't we turn this into a council discussion and talk about how far we want to go, because we are talking about a plan for flood prevention. I mean, there's biodiversity, there's street stability, there's setbacks, there's all these kind of things, but really aren't a part of the topic. The topic is flood prevention.
Correct.
But before we do that, let me ask you how much we budgeted for this study?
$250,000.
$250,000.
Yes.
So whatever we want to add to it, go for it, but that's going to add money and really doesn't deal issue with the central.
What I'm
cost.
recommending, that should be a separate RFP, come from planning and planning director.
Right.
You're hiring a different consultants to do that.
Right. Okay.
And planning director will be doing that and provide the, recommend the budget for it.
Okay. So thank you, Parviz. Don't go too far.
I'll be here.
So let's have our discussion, but let's all focus on really what we are doing, which is spending a considerable amount of money to deal with our flooding problem. And I appreciate what the Fluke people want to do. I do think I would question whether they want to spend the money to do everything they want to do on top of what we're already prepared to do. And the central problem is floods and flooding. When you're sweeping out your garage, you're not too concerned about what's happening to the stability of the bank 8 miles upstream, or what kind of ponding you're going to have over in Redwood City, because that's the only place to put it. You got to deal with the problem and solve it the best we can. So, with that in mind, Matt?
Yes?
Well,
I'm sorry, just one moment. You suggested certain things you'd like to see added or discussed as to whether they should be added. Do you want to carry on with that?
Well, Mr. Mayor, I guess I'm a little confused what the heck this RFP gets us. Because our engineer just said this is not to alleviate flooding, and I thought I saw language in here that said exactly that after this was all done and the things that were recommended were done, whether that be construction or, stabilizing banks and planting plants, that I thought I saw something in here that said that we would essentially eradicate our 100-year flood zone hazard. Did I not see that in here, or am I mistaken?
I did not say this does not eliminate flooding. The first part of the RFP is flood prevention. The second part of it is creek stabilization.
Here it is.
And
let me interrupt you if I might. Okay, Council, I'm on page 6 of the draft. Page 5 is the cover sheet. So page 6, item under flood prevention, under item A, all necessary and viable improvements to eliminate all areas of the 100-year flood designated zone A2 as shown on some map containing all the properties on the west and east side of Industrial Road, so forth and so on. I read that, and I thought we were going to eliminate all areas of the 100-year flood designated zone A2. I don't know. Call me crazy. That's what I read. So
That's true.
and yet that, okay, if that's true, that's fine. That's not what this council member was hoping for out of this plan. I was hoping for out of this plan something that would really look at our watershed area, including the areas that aren't in our city, getting whatever information we can that exists, that's free or whatever, but let's look at what's coming into, where's the water coming from, and where's it going, and how's it impacting our creeks, and what might we do in terms of policy, in terms of setbacks, in terms of, when I say policy, like impervious surfaces, what are we going to do about all this stuff to reduce the impact on the creeks, and yet, at the same time, hopefully work towards restoration of some of these creeks as ecological areas and not just make them drainage ditches.
The watershed study, Councilman Grocott, has been done. Where the water is coming from has been done. The volume of the runoff has been calculated at every step of the way, all the way to Highway 101. It's been done. The consultants will take that, and they can see, and they will see the entire city storm drain system. You can see where the water is coming from, how much is it coming from where. All of that has been done. When FEMA studied all this area in 1979, they decided, and the FEMA has done all that study. Watershed study has been done for years and years and years. It started in the 60s. FEMA started doing watershed studies to calculate how much water is coming down. Let me just, I didn't think we were going to need this, but it looks like we do, so I'll put it up. That area that is designated A2, that's Highway 101. So FEMA studied that from the entire watershed of Cordilleras Creek and Pulgas Creek, there is so much water coming here that is not going to get under Highway 101. At the same time, when it is high tide, all this water is going to back up and flood all these areas. All these studies have been done. Now we want to see what can we do but during the high tide and maybe 100-year storm, these areas will not get flooded. That's what we have to come up with. The rest of it, the study has been done. We know how much water is coming here, 2,000 cubic feet per second, or something like that. All of that has been done, calculated 3 or 4 times by FEMA, by San Carlos, Redwood City, county together. All of this has been done. This is another area. The straight line is the old railroad. So the FEMA calculated during hard year storm, there is so much water coming here that it cannot get through the railroad culvert, so all these properties would get flooded. When we did the grade separation, we calculated, we know all this area that is in the flood zone should not be in the flood zone. It's all in the RFP. But when we submitted documents to FEMA, FEMA said you have to calculate and tell us what's going to happen here. This is what these consultants are going to calculate. And then we want to see this railroad grade separation, did it eliminate all of it? We don't think it eliminated all of it, eliminated most of it. So they will calculate to see how much of it is eliminated, and we have to submit documentation to FEMA. So FEMA would amend the map and take these properties out of the flood zone. The rest of it, this area that is related to Cordilleras Creek, would remain in the flood zone because it's related to Cordilleras Creek. What we have to do in Cordilleras Creek or any other system to eliminate these properties from being in the flood zone. This area, this is city-owned property. This is Fairfield Avenue. These are all in the flood zone. Not related to any of the creeks. Is related to drainage system under 101 along the southbound off-ramp. This system does not have the capacity, and during high tide, this area gets flooded. What is the solution to solve this? We have done the study. We know basically what has to be done. We have to come with a cost estimate. For every piece of all of this, then there's a cost to design. There's an alternative of the designs, 1, 2, 3 alternatives, and that's where, based on that, the City Council can decide which one of them is worth doing, which alternative. City Council can decide which alternative is better environmentally or otherwise. So this is what this RFP does. And at the same time, because of Pulgas Creek and Cordilleras Creek, during heavy storm, there's a lot of material, eroded material coming down that blocks the culverts and the El Camino, for example, railroad and the industrial road. Going and keeping dredging that really is not a permanent solution. We've been doing that for years. Instead of cleaning the culverts and the El Camino and industrial road, we have to go up the stream and stop this erosion. That's the permanent solution. That's what the Regional Water Quality Control is looking for. They're saying don't come for a permit to remove the material that has come down. Go and stop the eroded material. Let's stop the erosion. And stopping erosion, we are saying no more using concrete walls. You using bioengineering, planting with plant and natural material that the creek will look natural and there is no more erosion. Stopping that erosion will solve some of these problems. Some of these problems, the Cordilleras Creek, is because creek has risen by 2 or 3 feet in the last 20 years. Does not have the capacity that it used to have 20 years ago, 25 years ago. If we stop the erosion and clean some of the sediment out of the Cordilleras Creek, that's the solution. We don't have to install major pipes or anything there. This issue, because of the high tide, this is very, very complicated, very expensive.
Just let me interrupt. Do council members have any specific questions on?
I have 3.
3 more? Can you
3
make them really
questions.
quick?
Hopefully you can answer them pretty quickly. Number 1, what's the date on this data? Number 2, where's the chamber on this map? And number 3, where's White Oaks? Because I have pictures on my computer of Cedar Street, Greenwood, people walking in the street in waders, and the water's up to their knees. Now, it may not be a 100-year flood zone, but...
I understand.
Yeah.
That's why it's in the RFP. And other localized flooding problems that the staff will identify. Exactly what the areas that you're saying. Chamber, for example, is not in the 100-year flood plain. But as you know, south of Laurel has flooding.
Where is the chamber on this map?
Chamber is...
I don't think
Right
it's
here.
actually, is it shown? 'Cause
Yeah, right
that's-
here, but it's not in flood zone, just on the west side.
Just outside the flood zone.
White Oak, right. But there is in the RFP that we're indicating that for the White Oak area, from Alameda to here, to Laurel, including White Oak, all this stuff, they have to come up with an alternative design to solve that problem. That's another part of it, that the area is not the flood zone,
Okay,
but it gets
quickly
flooded.
answer so we can move on. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions from the council members? We're ready for a motion to approve the RFP.
I would move that we approve, or that we authorize the release of the attached RFP for the preparation of a drainage master plan.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion made by Councilmember Doherty and seconded by Councilmember Griselli. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Doherty?
Yes.
Councilmember Grisilli?
Yes.
Councilmember Grocott?
Reluctantly, yes.
Councilmember Lewis?
Yes.
Mayor Davis?
Yes. Before we continue, let me, the parties, let me just make a point and talk to Mark a minute. I don't think we're going to make it through our revenue discussion, Mark. So with the council's consent, perhaps we could defer this until the first meeting in February?
Correct. I mean, we would like to move the study session to the first meeting in February. That'll coincide with our mid-year budget report in any event.
Okay, so if anyone's waited this long to talk on that issue, thank you very much, but we'll see you later. Jeff, Rebecca. Okay, Parviz, you got two more items. Can we do those?
Yes, the next one, this survey, we apologize that your last council packet, the survey was not included, so basically we have included the survey, and we request that you approve that this survey go online, and if you approve it, it's ready to go. We'll go online Wednesday, and we will keep it perhaps till the end of February, and once that is completed, staff will tabulate the results, and we'll report it to Traffic Transportation Commission, Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee, and eventually to City Council.
I think it's great. And, asking these specific questions, you're going to get all kinds of responses, and I'm sure we're prepared to deal with each and every one of them. But the question I have is, can we get a little broader distribution than the website? Can we take the listing and the specific one and deliver it to the senior area, to the adult community center, so people can be involved at that level, maybe the library or whatever outlet we
So
have.
that they can fill it in by hand, for example, and then
They can
turn
fill
it
it in by hand.
into...
Sure, we do. Of course, the disadvantage of that is makes it more time-consuming than the hard copy to tabulate, but that's fine.
Yeah, we understand. We'll be glad to help you with that.
Yeah, we'll do that, sure.
Can I just ask a question on it? And I don't want to derail this, and I apologize because maybe I should just made a call to ask a question or two. But when I originally thought that we were going to be doing an online survey, I thought it was going to be a little bit more comprehensive than this. In other words, this is report a problem, and then there's some safety walking tips. And I guess I was hoping there'd be a solution component to this. Like, in other words, an online survey of what kind of solutions do you favor? So we sort of can use this as a... And so my question is, we have a problem section. Is it possible that, in the... I think the report that you gave to us before, it had some like A through I items of potential, mitigation numbers for pedestrian safety issues. And I'd sort of like to take advantage of the online survey to be able to actually survey people on what they're leaning toward, whether it's like the flashing crosswalks in Belmont that are so effective, or what are people looking for?
What they would like to do to correct the problem?
Right. This just seems like a great way to solicit the problems in town.
We strongly recommend that, and we recommend it to BPAC, not to request or ask for solutions, because solutions from the people, the solutions to these problems is to be done by professionals, recommend by professionals, because the solutions will come. The stop signs everywhere and the speed humps on all the streets, and which is not practical, and then we have to answer and disappoint people. The solutions have to come from professionals. Once this is tabulated, we will recommend, based on what it is, that these studies in locations be identified, be studied by professionals, and
Excuse me, thank you, I got it. What I'm not suggesting that we have an anarchist approach to pedestrian safety problems, that whatever comes in the survey, we're going to go out and by golly, we're going to do, okay? I'm fully expect a professional response and study. That's separate from getting the impressions of where are people leaning, what are some of the solutions people are leaning towards, so we can actually evaluate those and give a thoughtful response to what those levels of interest are.
Councilman Lewis, we have all the solutions that are being recommended.
I'm not even sure why we're having this meeting. We've got all the information.
No, I know. It is really, I would not recommend it. If you like, we put it in there. I strongly recommend we do not do that. Let the people identify the problems, and let the professionals identify the solutions.
Perhaps maybe there's a middle ground to what Councilmember Lewis is looking for, Vice Mayor Lewis, and that is, I know that you've got that handbook of all these possible solutions that, for example, in the Loyola area, they said there's speeding, and so they wanted speed bumps and they wanted stop signs at every single corner and speed bumps mid-block. And when you sat down and talked to them about the consequences of that and the implications of that, and you educated them, they backed off in a lot of cases and started to see, well, yeah, no, wait, we're really disrupting normal traffic flow, which is actually going to exacerbate the problem rather than solving it. However, it might be able to provide an opportunity, because I know people are familiar with the various types of opportunities for traffic control, like the bulb outs and like the circles that we've put in, is maybe just solicit their feedback or have them rank kind of what they think are their ways or possible ways to mitigate speeding or things like that, and not tie it necessarily to any specific problem, but just sort of say, hey, what do you think about, of these, which would be your number one priority for reducing speeding in your neighborhood? Bulb outs, traffic, or traffic circles, something just to kind of, I guess, maybe to follow up on what Vice Mayor Lewis is saying, is just really more to try to get some public feedback around some of the solutions that they've seen and say, hey, I like that, or, you know what, I really don't like that. And I think you probably get, it's probably pretty intuitive. You probably get a lot of seniors saying, you know what, or a lot of people saying, I like the flashing crosswalks. I absolutely love the flashing crosswalks. I like the countdown timers on the, as you're walking across the street. So there's a lot of really good positive things, and then that might help us prioritize the funding, because I know that's probably the next piece, which is how do we address some of these issues in town. So maybe not, I can understand your sensitivity, Parviz, around not trying to set expectations, because I know in working with the folks, like I said, in very specific neighborhoods, people get very protective of their own neighborhoods, and they believe that there's speeding problems when, indeed, if you actually set up the speed monitors, oftentimes it's perception rather than reality. And so rather than kind of maybe just decouple those two and to try to solicit a little bit more feedback around possible approaches. Now, what that does do, though, I think, is it makes this survey more expensive, because you've got to have more money in developing it. And so I think that, and it obviously puts the burden then on your staff time to try to analyze the results as well.
It's not that it will be more expensive. We'll come to the point that the result of survey, we have to spend months and months just respond and say this solution will not work there, and we know it's not going to work. They will ask for a demonstration, and it is so expensive to demonstrate to people that this solution is not.
Parviz, what I was saying is that not offer up a solution for this particular problem, but really have a next question, which is of different types of possible traffic mitigation or speeding mitigation solutions. Which ones of them do you like? Which ones do you not like? Do you not like bumps? Do you like bumps? Do you
ranking of those
do a ranking
five
of
mitigation members, so we get a sense for what some of the different solutions that people favor over other solutions, because I think there's a variety of those.
It seems to me, though, that'd be a next step. We identify the problems, and they're going to be grouped. We're going to get a lot of them out here on San Carlos, I can tell you that. And then there's an opportunity to go out to those people, and these are the suggestions we have for remedying the problem. What works best or not so good, but you don't want to do it now, do you? Because then you have to deal with all of that input as well.
Exactly.
I think people are misunderstanding.
Yeah. How about if we continue this item, and perhaps we can work with Parviz to just fashion something you're comfortable with and we're comfortable with, and we'll bring it back. I really don't think it's a big deal. It's probably just one or two additional questions, and I don't think we're looking at a mountain of information to rifle through when we're all done.
It's a mountain of responses after it comes back.
Okay. Well, can you defer this for another meeting, Parviz, and meet with members Lewis and Dory and come up with something that's workable? Okay with that?
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right. So this item then will be deferred. And Parviz, while you're up there, why don't you take on item 10B?
I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
On 10B. Okay. Now we have a list on 10B of street improvements over the next 3 years. The only question I have, and the presumption is that for the Alameda, when we resurface, we'll also restripe. The bike lane goes back in, and everything is pretty and taken care of.
I would move adoption of the 3-year street repair and resurfacing plan.
We have a motion.
Second.
And we have a second. All in favor?
Discussion? Through the chair. I haven't said anything in a long time. Do I get one shot at this?
Is your street on here?
Yes. Is it? Is my street on here?
In the first.
You don't have to,
And if
you don't
it's
have to
not,
ask
why
about
is
it
it
because
not?
I'm going to.
Okay. I just want to understand the dollars here, because that's what I do. What you're saying is that together we'll have about $1,640,000, and we're estimating that it'll cost $1,550,000?
Because we don't have contract yet, we haven't gone out to bid.
Right.
By the
But
time
I mean,
we do
you're
all of
saying by
that,
deferring
we want to have something in reserve.
Right, but you're saying you're deferring 640, and you assume in the next budget you'll have $1 million. That's 1640, and you're saying the total's going to cost 1550.
Correct.
So we hope, if the bid comes in properly, that we'll have enough money to do all these.
Yes.
As opposed to now, when we do not have enough money because the bids were too high to do one part.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, sir.
The question I have is, looking at the streets, we do have Crestview on here, which I'm glad to see, because Crestview looks like a quilt. However, what we don't have is Crestview from Edgewood to Britain, or to complete it, actually, I think it would have to go all the way to Melody. And like I say, my experience on Crestview is it looks like a quilt.
From Melody to Edmond, though. Edmond is the street right up from Edgewood.
Is it? I don't know the streets that well.
Yeah, it's the one that goes into Povich Ridge.
So we are covering Crestview. That's my only concern, is the
But
lower part of Crestview.
You're right, we've done a lot of patching on the Crestview. And overlay Crestview is very, very expensive, as we are so wide. I think what we will do after this is all patching, I think after we do all this patching, we probably just fog seal it, so it will be.
Also, 4 inches of AC patches, just
These
more
are all,
quilting.
these are more of, what are you talking about?
We got to do something to that street to make it look
as I said,
contiguous,
yeah.
one piece.
Once we do all this patching, we will just seal the entire street, so.
Bob has to recuse himself, so I'm defending him up here.
I understand. No, we will do something to make it look good.
Some kind of
after we
overlay.
do all the patching, yeah.
I think that would be necessary. Those people have lived out there with a patchwork for too long. Thank you.
You did a nice job correcting that Alameda situation, by the way, at Eaton.
Yes. Thank you for that, too.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the motion? Roll call, please.
Councilmember Teagle Doherty?
Yes.
Councilmember Lewis?
Yes.
Councilmember Grocott?
Yes.
Councilmember Grisilli?
Yes.
And Mayor Davis?
Yes. Thank you, Parviz. That brings us to the last item, item 10A, consideration of Allied Waste 2007 rate application, refuse, recyclable, and plant material collection.
Through the chair, Mr. Mayor, do you need a motion to extend the meeting past 10:30?
Oh, I think we do, as a matter of fact. We're a little over
we can be
that
brief.
requirement. Would you give us another 10 minutes, please?
If it's quick, I have a flight out tomorrow morning early.
10 minutes
So,
will do it?
yes, I would
All
move
right.
that we
We got a motion for
extend it.
10. We got a second for 10?
Second.
We're all in favor for 10.
Aye.
There we go.
That gives you 1 minute.
I have nothing to add to the staff report.
Yeah,
I'd
very
be
good.
happy to introduce, though, they stayed here all night long, Evan Boyd, who is the general manager for Allied, as well as Carl Menny, the controller at Allied. They'd be happy to answer any of your questions. What we're asking for this evening, though, is authorization to issue the notice of your intent to raise rates, and then we will come back to you at the March 26, 2007 meeting with the detail of the rate increase. And at this point, we're looking at up to a 6.1% rate increase. I would like to note on the notice that we intend to send out, we have included the most common rates that we have in San Carlos. The rate sheet for every single rate is about 22 pages long. So we've just listed the most common rates. We would like to add there a note that all rates will be increased uniformly 6%. And then they could call if they have a question on their specific rate.
And
So happy to answer any of your questions.
If the detail turns out to be 6.2%, we're limited to 6%?
Correct.
And can we make up the difference if that
At a future
happens,
year.
or you're pretty sure that's not going to happen?
Well, if you wanted to take care of the entire anticipated balancing account, at this point, I don't know the outcome of the negotiations with
Okay.
Allied. So the report indicates if we were to take care of the entire negative balancing account, you'd need to raise rates about 9%. But what staff is recommending is we take care of the anticipated increased operating expenses as well as a portion of the balancing account, and then reevaluate it again next year.
Well done.
So we should have implemented the 3% increase that was proposed last year that we didn't. We deferred.
It was actually in 2005.
Oh, sorry, 2005.
But we did not implement it at that time because we had the reduced disposal cost. So the increased rates is really due to a lot of changes that Allied has made with some additional staff that they hired in the response to reducing the overtime.
And then the last question I had actually is, when was the last time that we did raise rates? Was it 2000?
January 2004.
2004.
And it was a 3% increase at that time.
So it's been a couple of years.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, I do
Yes, sir.
have a question. It's similar to what Inga Teal Doherty asked. And in fact, Bob talks about this all the time up here about, making incremental changes to rates rather than waiting and then really slapping people with a big change. How was the decision made to not implement the 3% that was authorized and then just, take that money, put it in reserves or whatever, rather than not implement it and then come to us and ask for a 6% increase when even the 6% doesn't cover apparently what your costs are, because now you got this 9% deal out there. How was the decision made not to implement it, thinking down the road and maybe saving from having to have a big increase down the road?
Well, actually, my understanding was the resolution was provided to, it was then BFI Allied, to raise the rates, and it was actually an oversight on their part that they did not actually raise the rates in 2005. So in retrospect, we didn't need to raise the rates because we did have that disposal savings.
You see where we're coming from, though, I think, right? As a council, it's a lot easier to do, a little 2 or 3% increase every couple of years rather than, especially when you've been authorized, and then to not do it and then come to us and ask for a 6% increase. That's what gets us in trouble, because people start calling us and saying, why did you hit me with and maybe 6% isn't really it, but like with sewer rates, all of a sudden 30% increase in sewer rates, that gets people's attention. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Point.
Well said. Any other questions for Lisa?
No, I would move that we, sorry, lost my little note here. Authorize staff to send the notice to residential and commercial rate payers of up to a 6% rate increase.
Second.
Roll call.
Councilmember Teal Doherty?
Yes.
Councilmember Grisilli?
Yes.
Councilmember Grocott?
Yes.
Councilmember Lewis?
Yes.
Mayor Davis?
Yes. Okay, that brings us to the end of our agenda. We will reschedule item 9A for the first meeting in February. And that's it. Thank you very much.